shadows in the frozen hills. The winter of 1895 draped Pennsylvania in a suffocating quilt of ice and silence. Snow had been falling for weeks, piling high along the narrow streets of the hill towns, swallowing fences, burying porches, and turning every dirt road into a frozen, rutted path where wagon wheels groaned. Beneath that stillness, however, there was something else, a tension unspoken, yet palpable like a heartbeat hidden beneath a thick layer of frost. Into this frozen landscape stepped Thomas Henley, an insurance investigator from New York. He arrived alone, carrying only a leather satchel, a pocket notebook, and a pair of cold, calculating eyes. Henley was not the sort of man to be distracted by the scenery or the discomfort of the bitter cold. His purpose was clear. Somewhere in these hills, beneath the polished veneer of Pennsylvania's most trusted insurance company, Eternal Life Insurance, something grotesque was hiding. Henley had seen fraud before barns burned to the ground for payout checks, accidental drownings, convenient deaths occurring mere weeks after a policy was signed. But what he had stumbled upon in the ledgers this time was different. The numbers didn't just hint at deceit, they screamed it. Massive payouts issued with unnerving regularity for 36 years, always to a tight web of beneficiaries. At first, it seemed like a statistical fluke. Then he noticed the pattern. The dead were men, women, and children of all ages, yet nearly every case could be traced back directly or indirectly to the same name. The Blackstone family. The Blackstones were the town's crown jewel, wealthy, devout, and seemingly incorruptible. Samuel Blackstone, the patriarch, was a man whose name opened doors in business and in church alike. His wife, Eleanor, was a celebrated benefactor of charities known for her gentle Christian heart. Their 3 sons each commanded influence in different corners of the community, banking, funerals, and insurance. Together, they were seen as the very foundation of the town's prosperity. And yet Henley had learned long ago that the most immaculate facades often hid the darkest foundations. He rented a small upstairs room in a boarding house, its walls thin and its wood stove barely adequate against the cold. For days he sat near the fire, reviewing the copies of company ledgers he'd smuggled from the New York office. His pencil scratched quietly as he marked names, circled dates, and underlined strange consistencies in cause-of-death statements. Almost all policies had been active for less than a year before the insured met an untimely end. Death certificates bore the signatures of the same 2 or 3 local physicians, and every single payout led through bloodline or business to the Blackstones. Henley knew better than to make a direct move. In towns like this, a stranger's presence was noticed immediately, and his questions would be repeated in kitchens and barrooms before nightfall. Instead, he played the role of a man looking to buy property, someone curious about the area, but harmless. It gave him a reason to linger, to talk to shopkeepers and church elders, and to overhear the small-town gossip that official records never caught. In a dimly lit saloon on the far edge of town, he caught his first real lead. 2 locals, well into their whiskey, murmured about red books and handshakes under the table between Samuel Blackstone and a certain Dr. Carruthers. Henley nursed his drink, leaning just close enough to catch fragments of their conversation without drawing attention. It wasn't much, but it was enough a name. A thread to pull. The next morning, he visited the modest dress shop of Ruth Callahan, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for sewing morning gowns faster than anyone in the county. Casually, Henley mentioned the Blackstones in conversation, Ruth went still, the needle in her hand, frozen mid-stitch. After a long pause, she said only, "Around here you survive by keeping your mouth shut." But her eyes betrayed her. There was anger there, and fear, and something else Henley had learned to recognize, a silent invitation to dig deeper. Henley left Ruth Callahan's shop with the faint chime of the doorbell still ringing in his ears. Outside, the cold bit at his face. Like teeth, the air so sharp it seemed to slice through wool and skin alike. He buttoned his coat higher, but it wasn't the temperature that made him quicken his pace. It was the knowledge that in this town, even the smallest scrap of information had to be guarded as though it were gold. Someone might have been watching from across the street. Someone might have seen him speaking with Ruth. He ducked into a narrow alley between two brick buildings, letting the shadow swallow him for a moment. Snow crunched under his boots as he lit a cigarette, giving himself a few minutes to think. Ruth had not told him much, nothing actionable, not by law enforcement standards, but it was the way she had said it, the tension in her voice, the tightness in her jaw. It told him that she knew more than she dared to speak aloud. In Henley's experience, people who knew too much in places like this had learned that speaking could shorten your life. Over the next week, Henley worked slowly and carefully. He became a fixture in the town's quieter corners, the back pew of the Methodist church on Sunday, the general store on weekday mornings, the saloon on Saturday nights. He watched the Blackstones move through the town like royalty, greeted with nods, handshakes, and the deferential smiles of people who owed them everything or feared them too much to do otherwise. Samuel Blackstone's presence was commanding without being loud. His voice when he spoke was deep and deliberate, his eyes sharp but always softened by an outward show of piety. Henley noticed something else too: funerals. They happened with unsettling frequency. Some weeks there were 2 or 3. He began attending them quietly, sitting at the back. The mourners often seemed dazed, as though the loss had happened so quickly they hadn't had time to process it. The Blackstones were always there. Eleanor with her handkerchief dabbing at the corners of her eyes. Samuel with his solemn nods, the sons managing the caskets with the efficiency of men who had done it hundreds of times. One cold morning, Henley found himself in the small cemetery on the edge of town. Snow lay thick over the graves, but he could still read the dates on some of the newer headstones. Many belonged to people under 40. Several bore the same month and year of death. He knelt by one of the graves, brushing the snow from its face. The name was Margaret Fielding, aged 27. She had died just 3 months after taking out a policy with Eternal Life Insurance. Henley's fingers tightened around his pencil as he wrote the name in his notebook. The list was growing. There were too many patterns now for coincidence. But patterns were dangerous. Patterns made people nervous, and nervous people had a way of disappearing in towns like this. That night, Henley sat in his room, the small oil lamp casting a warm circle of light on the table. Outside, the wind moaned through the eaves, and somewhere in the distance a church bell rang, once though there was no service scheduled. He spread his notes out before him, the names, the dates, the policies, the doctors, the undertakers. Every thread ran through the Blackstone family. Every payout was a brick in the empire they had built, not through commerce or industry, but through calculated death. He thought about Ruth Callahan again, about the look in her eyes. She could be the key. But if he pushed her too hard, she might shut him out entirely, or worse, she might end up in one of those graves. Henley had been in this line of work long enough to know the difference between truth and justice. Truth could be uncovered. Justice was harder to deliver. And in a place like this, justice often came too late. Henley's first sight of Dr. Carruthers came on a pale Wednesday morning, the sky the color of unpolished pewter. The physician was stepping down from his sleigh outside a modest brick building that served as both his home and office. Carruthers was in his early 60s, tall and lean, his spine unnaturally straight for a man his age. His black overcoat hung from his shoulders like a judicial robe, and his white gloves were spotless despite the slush underfoot. He carried himself with the ease of a man who had never needed to hurry, an ease Henley knew belonged only to those who felt untouchable. From across the street, Henley observed as a widow in mourning attire approached Carruthers with a slow, hesitant gait. She clutched a folded sheet of paper in her gloved hands, perhaps a bill, perhaps a death certificate. Carruthers accepted it without looking at her, tucking it into his breast pocket as though it were no more consequential than a grocery list. Then, with a faint, rehearsed expression of sympathy, he guided her inside. Henley made note of the time. 10 minutes later, she emerged alone, her posture more stooped, her face hidden beneath the brim of her bonnet. It was the pattern again. Henley had seen it in other towns. A grieving family, an official death certificate, a payout signed and sealed before the ground over the grave had settled. The Blackstones had the undertakers. Carruthers, it seemed, had the pen. Over the next week, Henley began tracking the doctor's movements. He followed at a distance, sometimes on foot, sometimes hiring a young stable boy to shadow Carruthers and report back. It wasn't difficult. The man's habits were predictable. Morning calls to a handful of patients, afternoons in his office, evenings often spent at the Blackstone residence, where his carriage could be seen hitched beside the family's imposing stone home. Henley didn't need anyone to tell him what those visits were about. Still, conjecture wasn't evidence. He needed something tangible, something that would stand up to the scrutiny of men who did not want to believe the truth. His opportunity came on a night when snow fell so heavily it muffled every sound but the crunch of boots and the groan of wagon wheels. Carruthers had been called to a house at the far edge of town, a small isolated homestead, where the light in the single front window flickered like a dying ember. Henley watched from the shadows as Carruthers entered. Less than an hour later, he emerged with no urgency. In his step, climbed into his sleigh and headed back toward town. Henley waited until the sound of hooves faded, then approached the house. The front door was ajar. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of camphor and something faintly metallic blood, though not fresh. A woman sat slumped in a chair beside the bed, her face drawn and pale. On the bed lay a man, eyes closed, skin waxen, the stillness of death unmistakable. Henley's gaze fell on the nightstand. There, beneath a glass of water, was a small vial with Carruthers' name etched into the label. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The contents were nearly gone. Henley slipped the vial into his coat pocket. It wasn't proof of murder on its own, but combined with the ledgers, the dates, and the doctor's proximity, it was enough to sharpen suspicion into something far more dangerous. That night, back in his room, Henley turned the vial over in his hands under the lamplight. He knew he couldn't keep it long. If Carruthers realized it was missing, he'd report it to the Blackstones, and then Henley's investigation would end in an unmarked grave. But for now, it was leverage. a thin, fragile lifeline in a place where the truth was buried as deep as the dead. Henley leaned back in his chair, listening to the wind batter the windows. He had been in Pennsylvania less than a month, yet already he could feel the black stones closing in, not with open threats, but with a subtle tightening of the air, a sense that every eye in town was watching him, waiting for him to step too far. And Henley knew himself well enough to understand that he would. 2 days later, Henley awoke to the sound of boots crunching on the snow just outside his boarding house window. The rhythm was wrong, not the steady step of a passer-by, but a slow, deliberate pacing, back and forth, like someone making sure he knew they were there. He stayed still for a moment, listening. Then came the knock, 3 short raps, evenly spaced. Henley buttoned his shirt and went to the door. A man stood on the other side, tall and broad-shouldered, his overcoat unbuttoned, despite the bitter cold. His face was unremarkable except for his eyes, flat pale and entirely devoid of warmth. "Mr. Henley," the man asked, his voice low and even. Henley nodded. "Mr. Blackstone asked me to deliver a message. He says you've been asking a lot of questions. Questions that upset people." The man's gaze didn't waver. "We value our privacy here. Folks don't like strangers stirring up old grief. Best if you kept your focus on your own affairs." Henley smiled faintly, the kind of smile that could be mistaken for agreement if you weren't paying attention. "I appreciate the concern," he said, his voice mild. "But my affairs happen to involve questions. That's my job." The man didn't smile back. "Jobs can change," he said before turning and walking away without another word. It was a warning, polite in tone but unmistakable in meaning. Henley had seen this dance before. They wouldn't move directly against him yet. Not while he was still a curiosity rather than a confirmed threat. But the line had been drawn. If he kept pressing, the next message would not come in the form of a conversation. Still, Henley had no intention of stopping. In fact, the warning had given him exactly what he needed, a confirmation that he was getting close enough to be noticed. That night, he returned to the saloon on the far edge of town, the same one where he'd overheard the gossip about Carruthers. The air was thick with pipe smoke, the heat from the stove fighting against the cold draft from the door. Henley ordered a whiskey and took a seat near the back, keeping his eyes on the mirror behind the bar so he could watch the room without turning his head. It didn't take long for him to notice 2 men at a corner table stealing glances in his direction. One of them was the man who had delivered the Blackstone's message. The other was younger, with a narrow face and restless hands that drummed against the table. Henley took his time finishing his drink, then rose and left without looking back. He didn't go to his room. Instead, he slipped into the alley across the street and waited. Sure enough, the 2 men emerged from the saloon a few minutes later, heading in the same direction he would have taken. They passed within arm's reach of his hiding place, their voices low but urgent. "Blackstone says keep him in sight. He leaves town on his own fine. If not." The rest of the sentence was lost in the wind, but Henley didn't need to hear it. He trailed them for half a block, just far enough to see them turn into a narrow side street. Then he let them go. There was no advantage in confronting them now. Better to let them think he was unaware of their surveillance. Better to keep playing the role of the man who didn't yet understand the danger he was in. But as he made his way back to his room, the decision was already forming in his mind. If the Blackstones were watching him, then it was time to watch them back closer than ever before. It began on a moonless Thursday when the sky was heavy with clouds and the snow fell in lazy drifting sheets. Henley had been watching the Blackstone residence for nearly a week, keeping track of who came and went and at what hours. Most nights were quiet lamps, dimmed early curtains drawn, but this night was different. Just after 9, the front door opened, spilling a wedge of golden light onto the snow. Thomas Blackstone, the eldest son, stepped out. He was tall like his father, his frame built for farm work but dressed tonight for business. A dark wool coat, gloves, and a scarf wound tight around his neck. Slung over his shoulder was a leather satchel, the shape of it too rigid to be clothing or supplies. Henley watched from the shelter of a bare oak tree as Thomas strode to a waiting sleigh hitched behind the house. The driver, a man Henley didn't recognize, kept his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Without a word, Thomas climbed in, and the sleigh pulled away, skimming over the snow in the direction of the northern hills. Henley moved quickly, cutting through back alleys until he reached the edge of town where his own rented mare was stabled. He saddled her in silence, the leather creaking softly, then guided her onto the road at a distance far enough to keep the sleigh's shape just in view. The wind carried the faint jingle of harness bells across the dark. The route they took was unfamiliar, winding away from the main trade road and into narrower paths, where the snow lay deeper and the trees pressed close on either side. After nearly an hour, Henley saw a faint orange glow ahead, flickering like a lantern in the dark. The sleigh slowed as it approached, then veered toward what looked like an old logging road. Henley dismounted before the turn, tying his mare to a pine and continuing on foot. The snow here muffled every step, but he moved with the patience of a man who knew one snapped twig could ruin everything. The road opened onto a small clearing. At its center stood a weathered barn, its doors thrown wide to reveal the source of the light. A half-dozen oil lamps hung from beams, their glow falling over a strange scene. Inside, a group of men stood around a long wooden table. On it lay rows of ledger books neatly stacked, and a series of burlap sacks, each stamped with the eternal life insurance seal. Henley's breath frosted in the air as he realized what he was seeing. This wasn't just a storage site, it was a counting house. Here, away from the eyes of town, the Blackstones tallied their profits and prepared their payouts to those who helped keep their machinery of death running. He inched closer, careful to keep to the shadows. Through a gap in the barn wall, he caught sight of Thomas opening his satchel. He removed a bundle of envelopes, each sealed with red wax, and handed them out to the men like a priest distributing communion. The recipients nodded, some slipping the envelopes into their coats, others weighing them in their hands with quiet satisfaction. Henley stayed just long enough to memorize the faces he could see. Then he eased back the way he came, retracing his steps to his mare. By the time he reached the road, the sleigh was already heading back toward town. He didn't follow this time. There was no need. He had seen enough to confirm what he'd suspected from the start. The killings were not random, and they were not the work of one man. This was a system meticulous, organized, and deeply entrenched, and systems this large did not collapse without a fight. As Henley rode back through the quiet dark, the snow beginning to cover his tracks, he felt the weight of the choice before him. He could turn over what he knew to the authorities, now risk them burying it like so many other inconvenient truths. Or he could go deeper, knowing that every step forward took him closer to the edge of a grave, dug in advance. Henley returned to town just after midnight, the streets empty and glazed with a thin crust of ice. The boarding house loomed at the end of the lane, its windows dark, but for a single lamp burning in the lobby. He dismounted quietly, leading his mare to the stable before climbing the narrow steps to his rented room. The first sign that something was wrong was the draft. The window to his left, which he always kept latched, hung open a finger's width, letting in the cold night air. The second sign was subtler. His coat, the one he'd left draped over the chair, was now folded neatly on the bed. Henley shut the door behind him without making a sound. His eyes moved slowly over the room, cataloguing every detail. Nothing looked taken, but that wasn't the point. Whoever had been here hadn't come to steal. They'd come to send a message. It didn't take him long to find it. On the desk, placed dead center atop the blotter, was a single playing card, the Queen of Spades. Across her printed face, someone had drawn a thin red line with a fountain pen, slicing her throat from ear to ear. Beneath the card, at a small glass vial, identical to the one he'd taken from Carruthers' patient's home. But this one was full the liquid inside an opaque, milky white. The cork was sealed with wax, and in the wax was pressed the Blackstone family crest. Henley didn't touch it. Not yet. He stood in silence, listening for any trace of movement in the hall. There was nothing but the faint hum of the wind outside. Still, the message was clear. They knew he'd been at the barn. They knew about the first vial, and now they were letting him know that the next one could be meant for him. He moved to the window, pushing it open wider and leaning out. The street below was empty, but in the alley across the way, a shape moved just enough to catch the corner of his eye. A man in a dark coat stepped back into the shadows, and then he was gone. Henley closed the window, locked it, and finally picked up the card. The paper was still slightly damp from the ink. Whoever had left it had done so not long before his return. He placed the card and the vial into the false bottom of his travel trunk, then sat at the desk lighting the lamp. His hands were steady, but his mind was a tangle of calculation. This was no longer about gathering evidence. It was about survival. And survival meant striking before they could close the noose. The barn in the hills was proof of their operation, but proof wasn't enough, not when the local law was likely in their pocket. Henley needed something bigger, something that could break through the wall of silence the Blackstones had built around themselves. And to get it, he would have to go to the one place no outsider was ever welcome, the Blackstone family's private burial ground. The Blackstone family plot lay on a rise just beyond the edge of town, separated from the churchyard by a tangle of old pines and a crumbling stone wall. Officially, it was private land, consecrated decades ago for family use only. Unofficially, it was a place the townsfolk avoided even in daylight. The air seemed heavier there, as though the ground itself carried some quiet, pressing weight. Henley approached just after 2 a.m, the moon buried behind low clouds, leaving the night black enough to swallow a man whole. He kept to the trees, each step sinking into the soft crust of snow, until the wall emerged in the darkness, knee-high in some places, shoulder-high in others, its stones frosted with ice. A wrought iron gate stood at the center, chained shut and crowned with a crest, a black stone set within a carved circle. The lock was old, but the chain was new, its links gleaming faintly in the lamplight Henley carried. He killed the light fish to pick from his coat and worked it into the padlock. A few patient twists and the shackle popped free. The creak of the gate's hinges seemed loud enough to wake the dead. Inside the ground rose gently toward a stand of bare oaks, their skeletal branches clattering in the wind. The graves here were not marked like the town's public cemetery. Instead of simple stones, each plot bore a low iron cross with a number engraved into a brass plate. There were no names, no dates, just numbers neat and uniform running in sequence along the rows. Henley crouched beside the nearest cross and brushed the snow from the plate. The number was 127. The next grave read 128. He moved down the row, noting each one until he reached a fresh mound near the far corner. The plate there read 21 out of 24. It stopped him cold. That number wasn't random. It matched the highest claim number in the ledgers he'd glimpsed at the barn. These weren't just graves. They were entries in an accounting system. From his satchel, Henley pulled a small leather notebook and began jotting the sequence. He worked in near darkness, the beam from his shuttered lamp kept low to avoid drawing attention. Every dozen or so graves he spotted irregularities numbers missing from the sequence. Those gaps, he realized, must have been the deaths staged to look accidental or natural, the ones buried elsewhere to avoid patterns too neat for insurance agents to ignore. As he worked his way toward the center of the plot, a shape caught his eye, larger than the rest, covered in a thick layer of snow. He brushed it clear to reveal a flat stone slab unmarked, but for a single deep groove across its surface. The groove wasn't decorative, it was a seam. He pressed against the stone and it shifted ever so slightly under his weight. Before he could investigate further, the sound of footsteps cracked through the quiet. Henley killed the lamp and dropped low between two graves. The steps grew closer, heavy, deliberate, and unhurried, as though the walker knew there was no need to rush. Through the gap between the crosses, Henley saw the glint of a lantern and the shape of a man in a long coat, a shotgun slung casually over one shoulder. The man stopped near the fresh grave numbered 21 and stood in silence for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and placed something small at the base of the cross. The object caught the lantern light, a silver coin, the kind used to pay the dead in old superstitions. He pressed it into the snow, straightened, and walked on. Henley stayed frozen until the footsteps and light faded into the trees. Only then did he move, retreating toward the gate, the numbers in his notebook burning in his mind. The black stone plot wasn't just a cemetery. It was a ledger carved into the earth, a physical record of the scale of their killings. And that unmarked stone slab, whatever lay beneath it, he knew was the key to everything. Henley waited 2 more nights before returning. He knew the burial ground was watched, but he also knew the patterns when the watchman passed through town to warm himself in the saloon, when the lantern light vanished from the far ridge. Tonight, the snow fell steady and quiet, blurring his footprints almost as soon as he made them. He reached the iron gate, slipped the lock as before, and crossed the rows of numbered graves with the precision of a man walking through a minefield. The slab lay ahead, dusted white, the seam barely visible. From his coat, Henley produced a small iron pry bar and a length of rope. Wedging the bar into the groove, he leaned his weight onto it until the stone shifted with a low, grinding sound. Cold air breathed up from below air that smelled faintly of cedar and something older metallic. The slab lifted enough for Henley to loop the rope through the gap and pull. Inch by inch, he dragged it aside until there was room for a man to slip through. Beneath lay a short stone stairwell dropping into blackness. He lit his lamp, took one last look over his shoulder, and descended. The steps ended in a narrow chamber, no wider than a corridor, the walls lined with shelves. On those shelves sat dozens of objects, ledger books bound in black leather, tin lock boxes, glass jars sealed with wax, and bundles of documents tied with twine. Each was labeled with a number matching the brass plates on the graves above. Henley moved to the nearest shelf, running his fingers over the spines of the ledgers. They were organized in perfect sequence, each entry noting the name, cause of death, payout amount, and beneficiary. Here was proof beyond question, proof that the Blackstones had kept meticulous, almost prideful records of every life they had purchased, stolen, or ended. Halfway down the chamber he found something stranger, a row of glass jars, each containing what looked like a folded square of paper floating in a clear liquid. He lifted one to the light heart tightening as the paper unfolded just enough to reveal handwriting signatures, perhaps. Death certificates, preserved as if they were relics. Further along, a small wooden chest sat apart from the rest, its lid carved with a black stone crest. Henley knelt, working the clasp open, and inside found an assortment of silver coins identical to the one he had seen left at grave 2124, alongside a narrow ledger with no numbering system at all. The entries here were short-coded phrases, done in the river fire, took the house, child returned to dust. These were killings that had never been claimed murders without insurance payouts, acts done for reasons other than profit. Henley was still bent over the chest when he heard a faint metallic click from above, like the closing of a gun's action. He froze, head tilted, listening. The next sound was worse, the slow scrape of the slab being dragged back into place. He killed the lamp, instantly plunging the vault into darkness. The scent of the cold air from above vanished as the stone sealed shut, and with it came the muffled echo of a voice low, steady, and far too calm. "Mr. Henley," the voice called down. "We've been expecting you. All right, let's trap Henley inside the vault and take the tension up to a breaking point." The voice slid through the darkness like oil coating every thought in Henley's mind. It was deep, unhurried, and close enough that he could imagine the speaker leaning over the open slab, smiling. "You've been a very busy man," the voice continued, "poking into places you don't belong, counting what isn't yours to count." Henley stayed silent, his back pressed to the cold stone wall. In the dark, the chamber felt smaller, the air tighter. He pictured the layout in his mind, the shelves, the chest, the narrow stair leading up. He had no illusions about fighting his way out. Whoever was up there held the high ground, and likely a gun aimed right at the stairwell. The voice grew softer, almost conversational. "These ledgers you're so interested in. They're not just paper, Mr. Henley. They're the lifeblood of a family. Every number, every entry paid for in sweat, risk, and a certain art." Henley's lamp lay cold in his hand, but he didn't dare strike it. Light would make him a target. Instead, he moved his fingers over the floor, searching for anything, a loose stone, a tool, even a shard of broken glass. Above boots scraped against the slab. "I'll give you one kindness," the voice said. "You can leave here alive, provided you put everything back where you found it and forget the name Blackstone ever crossed your lips." It was a lie. Henley could hear it in the careful control of the words, in the faint edge of amusement. They'd seal him in here the moment he complied, leave him to suffocate among their secrets. His hand found the pry bar. It wasn't much, but it was weight and leverage. He slid it silently along the floor until it rested at his side. The voice came again, almost cheerful. "Or you can refuse and we settle it here between the two of us. I rather prefer that. Cleaner, no loose ends. A metallic clink followed something small dropping onto the top step. It rolled once, twice, then came to rest against Henley's boot. A coin. Silver. Cold even through the leather. The same kind they left for their dead. That was the moment Henley decided there would be no negotiation. He swung the pry bar upward with all his strength, the tip smashing into the underside of the slab. The impact rang like a bell in the confined space, jolting the stone just enough to throw the man above off balance. Henley heard a grunt, then the scuff of boots retreating. He didn't waste the opening shoving the bar into the seam he heaved until the gap widened. A gunshot exploded in the night, deafening in the stone chamber. Splinters from the step above rained down, stinging his face. Another shot followed, ricocheting off the wall behind him. Henley didn't stop. He drove upward again, this time with his shoulder against the slab, forcing it open far enough to roll onto the frozen ground above. The cold hit him like a slap, but he didn't care, he was out. The man in the long coat stood a few yards away, shotgun raised, the black stone crest gleaming on the pin at his lapel. Henley didn't think. He threw the pry bar. It caught the man square in the shoulder, sending the gun wide as it roared a third time. By the time Henley reached the trees, the burial ground was behind him, the ledgers still hidden below. But now he knew their worth. And the black stones knew he knew. All right, let's carry Henley into the aftermath, where survival shifts into strategy. Henley didn't stop running until the burial ground was a smudge of darkness swallowed by the tree line. His breath came in sharp white bursts, each step sinking into the snow, each heartbeat loud enough to feel in his teeth. Somewhere behind him, the man with the shotgun might still be giving chase, or he might be circling wide, knowing exactly where Henley would try to go next. He kept off the road, following the frozen ribbon of a creek until it bent toward the outskirts of town. There, half hidden behind a derelict freight warehouse, he crouched in the shadow of a collapsed wall, forcing himself to breathe slow to listen. Only the groan of wood in the wind. No footsteps, no voices. From the inner pocket of his coat, he pulled his small leather notebook, the one with the sequence of grave numbers, and checked that it was still dry. Those numbers, incomplete as they were, could connect dozens of unexplained deaths to the black stones. But in the wrong hands, they were also a map, straight back to him. He needed a safe place to think somewhere the black stone's influence didn't reach. That ruled out every boarding house, tavern, and hotel in town. Even the sheriff's office was a risk. Henley had seen the sheriff's name on the beneficiary column of a 10-year-old claim. Instead, he crossed the rail yard, keeping low between the silent boxcars, and made for an old signal tower on the edge of the tracks. It had been boarded up for years, abandoned when the new line went through, but Henley had used it before, a place with one narrow entrance and a view in every direction. Inside, he lit a stub of candle and spread the notebook on the dusty floorboards. He traced the sequence of numbers with his fingertip, recalling the gaps he'd seen on the graves. Each missing number was a ghost, a life erased without the pretense of insurance. Those gaps might be even more dangerous to the black stones than the complete set, but proof alone wouldn't be enough. The black stones had money reach and a habit of making problems disappear. He couldn't simply walk into a federal office and expect the truth to survive the trip to a courtroom. No, he'd have to dismantle them from the inside, one piece at a time. Henley thought of the unmarked chest in the vault, the coins, the coded ledger. That book wasn't just a record. It was leverage. Whoever understood those codes could expose crimes the Blackstones had buried for decades. But to get it, he'd have to go back into the burial ground, and next time they'd be waiting. A gust rattled the tower's windows, bringing with it the faint smell of coal smoke from the freight line. Henley stared out at the darkness beyond the tracks, feeling the weight of the cold and the heavier weight of the choice before him. He could leave now, burn the notebook, disappear into another state, take the safety that the dead beneath those numbered crosses would never have. But safety wasn't what brought him to Pennsylvania. Henley pinched out the candle, tucking the notebook away. His plan was simple, in words lethal. In execution, find an ally the Blackstones couldn't buy, decode the ledger, and bring the whole family down quietly, at first then so publicly that no chain, no slab, no shotgun in the night could bury it again. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world sharp and still. Henley stepped into it, his boots whispering against the crust. Somewhere ahead, the Blackstones slept certain their secrets were safe. By dawn, he'd be closer to proving them wrong. All right, let's carry Henley into the aftermath, where survival shifts into strategy. Henley didn't stop running until the burial ground was a smudge of darkness swallowed by the tree line. His breath came in sharp white bursts, each step sinking into the snow, each heartbeat loud enough to feel in his teeth. Somewhere behind him, the man with a shotgun might still be giving chase, or he might be circling wide, knowing exactly where Henley would try to go next. He kept off the road, following the frozen ribbon of a creek until it bent toward the outskirts of town. There, half hidden behind a derelict freight warehouse, he crouched in the shadow of a collapsed wall, forcing himself to breathe slow to listen. Only the groan of wood in the wind. No footsteps, no voices. From the inner pocket of his coat, he pulled his small leather notebook, the one with the sequence of grave numbers, and checked that it was still dry. Those numbers, incomplete as they were, could connect dozens of unexplained deaths to the Blackstones. But in the wrong hands, they were also a map straight back to him. He needed a safe place to think, somewhere the Blackstones' influence didn't reach. That ruled out every boarding house, tavern, and hotel in town. Even the sheriff's office was a risk. Henley had seen the sheriff's name on the beneficiary column of a 10-year-old claim. Instead, he crossed the rail yard, keeping low between the silent boxcars, and made for an old signal tower on the edge of the tracks. It had been boarded up for years, abandoned when the new line went through, but Henley had used it before, a place with one narrow entrance and a view in every direction. Inside, he lit a stub of candle and spread the notebook on the dusty floorboards. He traced the sequence of numbers with his fingertip, recalling the gaps he'd seen on the graves. Each missing number was a ghost, a life erased without the pretense of insurance. Those gaps might be even more dangerous to the Blackstones than the complete set. But proof alone wouldn't be enough. The Blackstones had money, reach, and a habit of making problems disappear. He couldn't simply walk into a federal office and expect the truth to survive the trip to a courtroom. No, he'd have to dismantle them from the inside, one piece at a time. Henley thought of the unmarked chest in the vault, the coins, the coded ledger. That book wasn't just a record. It was leverage. Whoever understood those codes could expose crimes the Blackstones had buried for decades. But to get it, he'd have to go back into the burial ground. And next time, they'd be waiting. A gust rattled the tower's windows, bringing with it the faint smell of coal smoke from the freight line. Henley stared out at the darkness beyond the tracks, feeling the weight of the cold and the heavier weight of the choice before him. He could leave now. Burn the notebook, disappear into another state, take the safety that the dead beneath those numbered crosses would never have. But safety wasn't what brought him to Pennsylvania. Henley pinched out the candle, tucking the notebook away. His plan was simple, in words lethal in execution. Find an ally the Blackstones couldn't buy, decode the ledger, and bring the whole family down quietly, at first then so publicly that no chain, no slab, no shotgun in the night could bury it again. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world sharp and still. Henley stepped into it, his boots whispering against the crust. Somewhere ahead, the Blackstones slept certain their secrets were safe. By dawn, he'd be closer to proving them wrong. The search for an untouchable ally. Henley moved with the stillness of someone who knew he was being hunted. He left the signal tower before first light, cutting across frozen fields where his trail would be lost in the churn of wind. In the distance, church bells tolled 6 times, the sound swallowed quickly by the hills. He needed someone beyond the Blackstones' web, someone with no business interests in Pennsylvania, no reason to care about their fortunes, and no fear of their reach. That narrowed the field considerably. A name kept circling back in his thoughts: Elias Ward. They'd crossed paths years ago during an arson case in St. Louis. Henley, investigating insurance fraud, Ward quietly feeding him the details he couldn't get through official channels. Ward was not a lawman. He was something harder to pin down, a fixer with a knack for finding information others meant to bury. If anyone could decode the ledger's shorthand and make it lethal, it was him. But Ward came with his own price, and Henley would have to convince him the risk was worth taking. Finding the ghost in the rail lines. Ward's last known haunts were transient places, rail depots, river docks, card rooms in back alleys. Henley boarded a westbound freight under a false manifest, riding at the empty space between coal bins, the cold gnawing at his bones. By the second night, he reached the small rail junction of Braddock Mills, a place too rough for the Blackstones to bother owning outright. The saloon nearest the depot smelled of whiskey and axle grease, the floor slick with melted snow. Henley spotted Ward at a corner table, half in shadow, dealing a quiet game with 3 men who looked more like armed escorts than opponents. His eyes flicked up only once as Henley approached, and for a moment there was no recognition than the faintest smirk. "Thought you were dead," Ward said without looking at his cards. "Seems I was only half right." Weighing the risk, Ward didn't agree to anything right away. They spoke in fragments over the clatter of poker chips and the drone of the saloon piano. Henley kept the ledger's existence vague, at first calling it a book with names and an empire's nervous system. Ward kept sipping his drink, his silence forcing Henley to fill the spaces. When Ward finally leaned forward, his voice dropped to a whisper. "If this book is what you say, it is the men who own it will kill you just to keep the rumor from spreading, which means if I help you, they'll kill me too." Henley met his eyes. "Then we make sure they can't." Ward studied him a long moment, then shrugged. "All right. But if I'm in all the way. That means I call the plays, and if you lie to me even once I walk, and you won't see me coming when I do. The first lead." Outside Pennsylvania. They moved west that night, avoiding main roads until they reached a town called Merrow's Ford. Ward had contacts there, an undertaker who kept records the county never saw, and who sometimes sold information for the right price. In a dim back room smelling of formaldehyde, the undertaker produced a stack of old burial permits. Many bore the same notary mark Henley had seen on black stone claims. See that Ward tapped the margin. Means the body was claimed by an authorized agent before burial. Your people have been at work here for years, not just in Pennsylvania. This is bigger than you thought. Henley felt the old weight settle deeper. Every page meant more dead, more ground to cover, and more danger. The shadow in the snow. They left Merrow's Ford at dusk, heading for a safe house Ward kept in a mill town, 2 counties over. Snow began to fall hard, turning the road into a narrow tunnel of white. Halfway there, Henley noticed the tracks fresh parallel to their own wagon ruts, then cutting closer. Ward saw it too. "Rider," he said. "Been on us since town." They pushed the horses faster, but the sound of hooves never faded. Then, as they crossed a narrow bridge over a frozen creek, a figure emerged from the tree line, a man in a dark coat, silver crest glinting on his lapel. Blackstone, setting the counter-trap Ward, didn't break stride. "Keep going," he muttered. "We'll turn him." 2 miles on, they veered off the road into a thicket, circling back until they could watch the rider pass below. When the man slowed to check their tracks, Ward raised his rifle, but Henley stopped him. "No shots, not yet. If one of them goes missing, they'll send more." Instead, they let the rider pass, then followed at a distance, noting the route he took. It led straight back toward the Blackstone estate. Now they knew the family had them marked, and every move from here on would be shadowed. The decision to return. Back at the safe house, the fire popped in the grate, throwing shadows over the walls. Ward spread the undertaker's permits beside Henley's notebook. Together, they mapped the overlap places where names, dates, and causes of death formed a perfect mirror to the ledger entries in the vault. Ward leaned back. "We can keep collecting scraps like this, but the only way to break them is with that ledger. The real one." Henley stared into the fire. He could still feel the cold stone of the vault steps under his hands, still hear the voice calling down. Going back meant walking into their den, but without that book, all they had was smoke. "Then we go back," he said. "And this time, we don't leave empty-handed." Planning the break-in. The next morning, the safe house smelled of coffee and coal smoke, but the air was tight with the weight of what they were about to do. Ward paced the length of the narrow room, pointing with his mug at the crude map spread on the table. "We can't go through the main house. They've probably doubled the watch since your last visit. The vault's in the south wingstone foundation, no windows on that side. Which means the coal chute." Henley leaned over the map. "It's narrow." Ward shrugged. "So are you. And we only need one man inside at first to get the door open from within." They agreed on the rest approach after midnight in the lull between watch rotations. Keep lantern light low to avoid the glass catchers on the eaves, and carry only what they could afford to lose. If either of them got caught, the other was to run no matter what. Henley didn't argue. There was no romance in this kind of work, only odds, and theirs were thin. Recon at the Blackstone estate. 2 nights later, they left the safe house under a moonless sky, cutting across frozen pasture toward the rise where the Blackstone estate loomed like a dark crown. The chimneys bled smoke into the cold, a faint smell of burning hickory drifting on the wind. Ward lay flat in the frost, glassing the grounds with a small brass scope. 2 guards on the west porch, one walking the perimeter. Watchtowers empty. That's our gap. They moved low, skirting the barn where horses stamped in the dark. The coal chute sat half hidden behind stacked barrels, its iron cover iced shut. Ward worked it open with a pry bar, the hinge squealing softly. "After you," he whispered. Henley slid into the black boots, finding the angled shaft until his hands met the cold stone floor of the basement. He waited for Ward's muffled thud behind him. Then they crept toward the faint glimmer of the vault door at the corridor's end. The vault door. Up close, the vault was more imposing than Henley remembered, iron bands riveted into the stone, a lock plate with 3 nested tumblers. Ward knelt, brushing frost from the metal. "Not built for speed," he murmured. It took 5 full minutes, each click loud as gunfire, in the stillness before the last tumbler gave. The door swung inward on silent hinges, the cold air inside carrying the scent of old paper and cedar oil. Rows of shelves lined the walls, each stacked with tin boxes and bound volumes. In the center sat the ledger, a thick, leather-bound book with its spine cracked from use. Henley lifted it, the weight more than just physical. Ward flipped it open, his eyes narrowing. This isn't just payouts and claims. These are coded shipments, names disguised as cargo manifests, dates tied to train schedules. They've been moving something alongside the bodies. Almost caught a floorboard creaked somewhere above. Henley froze, every muscle locking. Ward shut the ledger and slid it under his coat. The sound came again, closer this time, directly overhead. Then the muffled stomp of boots on the basement steps. They darted behind a shelving unit just as the door opened and a guard stepped in, lantern held high. The light washed over the vault's outer wall, stopping inches from where Henley crouched. The guard muttered something about a loose hinge, inspected the lock, then turned back toward the stairs. The door shut with a heavy thud. Henley exhaled slowly, his palms slick. The escape route. They couldn't risk the coal chute again, not with the guard still nearby. Ward led them deeper into the basement through a narrow tunnel lined with old wine racks. The air grew damp, the stone walls sweating in the cold. At the far end, they found a rusted grate opening into a drainage culvert. Ward kicked it loose and they slid into the icy channel, the water numbing their legs instantly. It ran under the pasture and out into the wooded ravine below the estate. By the time they reached open ground, the sky was paling with the first hints of dawn. They didn't stop moving until the estate was just a black smudge on the horizon. The weight of the ledger back at the safe house. They dried their boots by the fire while Ward began decoding the first section. What emerged was worse than Henley had imagined. The ledger tied Blackstone shipments to unexplained fires, mine cave-ins, even river sinkings, every disaster carefully insured, every payout funneled back into the family's control. Ward looked up from the pages. Henley. This book doesn't just prove murder. It proves they've been building something. A network. And if they've been doing this for 36 years, it's already everywhere. Henley stared into the flames, the truth settling like lead in his gut. This wasn't about bringing down a single family anymore. It was about severing a vein that ran straight through the heart of American commerce, and doing it before the Blackstones realized they'd been cut. Ciphers and soot. They worked the ledger like men bracing open a coffin lid. Ward spread butcher paper over the table and began sketching the bones of the cipher, how the columns of figures snaked down the margin, how select digits corresponded to train lines, how the same 6 letters appeared inside different words at regular intervals, like nails hammered in a pattern only insiders would see. Block substitution masked as accounting. he muttered, tapping the page with a dull pencil. They learned it from someone who thinks in inventories. Henley read aloud the first names they could stitch together: county commissioners and insurance adjuster in St. Louis, 2 freight agents who'd gone missing during the strike year. Threads formed. Dates aligned with published tragedies Ward had clipped from old gazettes: the mill blaze that killed 12 and paid out 30,000 in a week, the river packet that sank without a storm, the mine shaft collapse paid twice over, once for equipment and once for miners' lives, each widow's grief reduced to a policy number. But a second pattern worked beneath the first faint as watermarks. Ward circled it with his thumbnail. Here the miscreants transit columns. They spike before certain incidents drop to nothing after. It isn't just money moving. It's goods. He read the disguised cargo lines again, translating under his breath: axle grease, tar barrels, pitch rope, chloroform, quicklime, and a final entry repeated every 3 pages in all seasons: inert chassis return. The phrase made Henley's skin tighten. Whatever chassis meant here, it traveled out, and then came back untouched by fire flood or law. He took a walk to force blood through legs that had fallen numb. Outside noon couldn't quite lift the frost glare from the dirt lane. A dog barked 2 farms over. Somewhere a hammer struck iron, comforting proof that honest work still existed within riding distance of the rot. When he returned, Ward had pinned a second sheet above the hearth and was mapping rails in charcoal, a web stretching from the hollow to the river cities and back through the coal fields. At the center lay a symbol Ward had scrawled in block letters: Blackstone Consolidated. Around its spurs that fed meat, lumber, shale, cotton, each line more vein than track. If the ledger proved a crime, the map proved a circulatory system. "What do we do with it?" Henley asked. Ward checked the flue, lowered his voice. "A trove like this breaks 2 ways. Publish it raw, and they shout forgery. Bury you in suits, light a match under your porch. But if we take it to someone with a printing press and a safe, someone who hates them for reasons older than ours." He let the thought hang the room's hush, filling with the ledger's papery breath. "We'll need a friend with ink and teeth." Henley thought of the girl in Charleston who had once broken a mare with a single column and a stack of affidavits, who laughed like matches and wrote like lightning. "Clara Judd," he said. The name sparked heat in Ward's eye that wasn't from the fire. "If she prints it, the railheads will read it by lunch and the Capitol by supper." "Then we ride at dusk," Ward said. "And we ride quiet, because the moment the ledger left its shelf, something listened." They wrapped the book in oilcloth and slipped it beneath a sack of flour, disguising treason as bread. Ward damped the stove, pocketed the cipher sheets, and rehearsed a lie for anyone who asked. 2 men headed to market, nothing in their bags but winter staples. Henley saddled the sorrels, tightening each cinch twice. Every leather creak sounded like a confession. When the last latch clicked, the house felt smaller, as if its beams knew they were about to be weighed and found wanting. Ward paused at the threshold, palm pressed flat to the ledger's hidden spine the way a penitent touches a saint's bone. "Ink and teeth," he repeated softly before they bring flame and rope. "A friend with ink." They cut across the back roads until the ruts gave way to plank streets and gaslight made halos in the early fog. Charleston woke like a harbor city always did, clank of derricks' gulls, arguing over nothing, newspaper boys with cold fingers and the hoarse throats. Clara's building sat over a print shop, its windows smudged with ink and the outline of words ghosted backwards on the panes. If the Blackstone's world smelled of cedar oil and old currency, hers smelled of lead type, hot paper, and the sharp, clean bite of turpentine. Clara opened the door before they knocked. "You look like a sermon after a house fire," she said by way of hello, stepping aside to let them pass. Her hair was pulled back with a strip of twine, her cuffs pinned up a smear of black on her cheekbone like war paint. She nodded at the flour sack. "Either you've brought me bread or a lawsuit." "Both," Ward said. He eased the oilcloth free. The ledger hit the table with a solid, guilty thump. Clara didn't touch it at first. She walked a slow circle, reading the spine as if it might speak, then pulled a pair of kid gloves from her drawer and slid them on. "Tell me everything from the first whisper to your last heartbeat," she said, and they did, leaving nothing out: the coal chute, the guard's lantern, the culvert, water that numbed to bone. Ward sketched the cipher. Henley traced the rail map with a forefinger, naming counties like confessions. When Clara finally opened the book, she didn't gasp or curse. She made a soft sound low in her throat, the hum she gave when a sentence arrived, whole and dangerous. "God," she said after a time they were greedy enough to write their own rope. She pointed to the inert chassis. "Return." That's equipment for setting ablaze and walking it back out through a crowd while the firemen choke. Aluminum frames that don't burn, wheel sets for swift exit. I wrote on it last year, brief piece. The manufacturer sued me and lost. If that line repeats, they're staging calamities with touring apparatus. Henley swallowed. The images came too easily, a crate on a wagon. A latch snapped fire, blooming from a street corner, while a man in a clean coat wheels away the heart of it. "We'll need corroboration," Clara continued, snapping back to process. "Affidavits, shipping tickets, names of the dead attached to a policy number. I can hold the presses for 36 hours. Then I run it as a series. We'll open with a map your web and one event pulled apart so thoroughly they can't claim coincidence. Which event hurts them and persuades the world," the mill ward said. "Everyone remembers the children." Clara's jaw set. "Then we strip that day to studs, who ordered the pitch rope, who signed receipt, which adjuster delivered the first payout, which Blackstone cousin bought a new carriage inside a week." Her eyes lifted to them, measuring courage against consequence. "You realize they'll come burning." Ward shrugged without lightness. "We brought you the match." "You brought me the truth," she corrected, then raised her voice toward the back room. "Abel lock the alley door. Pull the steel shutter. Tell the boys to run the war fonts and grease the press." A young man with ink-mottled hands appeared, eyes widening at the ledger. Clara tossed him a set of keys. "We're a monastery for the next 2 days. No one in or out without my say." She turned back to Henley, a brief smile tilting through the worry. "You always do find me when the city's ready to riot." "Or when it needs to," he said. She took off the kid gloves and finally, with her bare hands, laid the ledger open. Flat. "All right, then," she whispered to the book and to the storm it promised. "Let's make a sound so loud even money can't sleep through it. The first counter move." They didn't have 36 hours. The warning arrived on a piece of butcher twine tied around a brick that came through the front window at twilight. Glass scissored across the newsroom. The brick tumbled, unrolled its ugly message, "Leave the dead to the dead." Clara didn't flinch, only said, "Abel sweep," and swung the steel shutter down, throwing the room into a cave of lamplight and reflected type. Ward checked his pocket watch, then the peephole. too fast, he said. No one outside knew we had it, which means inside the estate the lock's check showed. They've got men who notice weight gone from a shelf. He drew the curtain aside a breath's width. Two shapes leaned in the alley's gloom caps, low coats, cut clean house guards dressed to pass as dock men. They'll watch the back. Others will circle to the press room to cut power. Then they wait for panic to flush us. Clara moved through her room with a general's economy, turning off the front lamps and lighting two in the back, creating decoys for shooters who liked silhouettes. "We can ride it out," Abel said, swallowing. "We've got shutters bars the stair ladder. We've got paper and meat," Clara cut in. "They've got turpentine and time." Henley thought of the culverts cold, the way water carried sound. "If they burn, we don't want to die in a kiln." He rolled the ledger shut and bound it again. "We move it now," to where Abel asked, voice up a pitch. Clara looked toward the ceiling as if she could see through to the roof lines and beyond them the cathedral, and somewhere in the maze of alleys, a place invisible by design. "There's a bindery on Wren Street. Owner owes me a favor and keeps a safe for finished plates. Underground room brick vaulted 2 exits. If we could reach the gallery roof cross to the cooperage, take the catwalk over Barker's yard, we could." Ward had already shouldered his coat. "We could." He peered through the peephole again. "They've split, 2 at back, 1 crossing the street. Their captain's patient. He'll have a cart to move bodies and a story for the police." Clara gathered the cipher sheets, shoved them into a tin of biscuit flour, and slapped a lid on it, hard enough to send a white puff into the air. "We go high," she decided. "Abel, get the roof ladder. Henley, you carry bread and the ledger. Ward, you take back guard if he noses the stair." The building groaned as if it understood what was about to be done to it. They climbed the ladder, rattling just enough to make every heartbeat countable. Above the trapdoor stuck. Abel pried. Ward jammed his shoulder. The wood gave with a moan that might as well have been a shout. Street air knifed in cold and metallic. They spilled onto the roof. A gull screamed as if gleeful. From the alley below, a voice calm, almost bored. "Light it," then the sound of liquid poured, and the sulphur kiss of a match. Clara didn't look back. "Run," she said, and ran. Fire on Barker's yard. They moved across the roofs like people who had never been on the ground. Shingles, tin tar, paper. Each material had its own slipperiness. Each gap had its own language of risk. Henley learned it on his feet, breath fogging the flour tin, banging his hip like a clock. Behind them, flame breathed through the shutter slats and found the ink, and the ink found the rolled newsprint, and the press that loved friction gave it gladly. Heat rose with a roar that silenced gulls. The building below them turned into a lantern. At the first jump, Abel hesitated. Henley grabbed his belt and launched them both, their boots hitting the cooperage roof with a drum note that echoed down the alley. Men shouted. In another life, those voices would be dock hands calling to each other. In this one, they were money's lungs. Ward reached the catwalk, first tested its sway, then waved them on. Barker's yard stretched below a skeleton of stacked barrels, and the geometry of commerce circles inside squares lines shooting toward the river. A foghorn moaned as if the harbor itself frowned. Halfway across, a figure stepped from the far hatch. Clean coat, calm eyes, a scar like an unstitched seam across the mouth. He carried no pistol in his hands because his pistol waited in the men behind him and the fire behind those men. Evening he called the word courteous and wrong. You've something that got lost." Clara didn't slow. "Get out of my way," she said, as if to a chair that had chosen a bad place to be. The man's smile was small and tired. "I read you. You're good. You might have had a long career in fiction if you hadn't mistaken the ledger for a plot. Put it down and come warm your hands." Ward lifted his chin toward Henley. That was the sign. Henley dropped his shoulder, took the last 10 feet fast, and when the clean coat moved to block Ward, cut left hard, slamming his shoulder into the hatch post. The catwalk shuddered. The bolt that should have been replaced last spring sheared with a sound like a tooth breaking. The far end of the walkway dropped 6 inches, enough to knock the balance from any man who counted on the world to stay put. Clean Coat's eyes flicked down in calculation. By the time they came up, Clara's knee had found his ribs and Ward's forearm his throat. He went down with a sigh of surprise more than pain. "Go," Ward grunted. He brought friends. He had 2 men stepped onto the roof, not impatient, not excited professional. The first fired a warning into the tar so close to Henley's boot that tiny black stars jumped. The second sighted for the tin in Henley's hand, perhaps guessing it held the ledger's guts. Henley pivoted and the shot took empty air, leaving a hole that bled pitch. Clara yanked the hatch and shoved them into the dark. The cooperage smelled of sap and salt. They thundered down a stair into an aisle of hanging staves, then another, then a low brick passage where water ticked from an iron pipe into a trough. A rat skittered ahead like a bad thought. Abel panted wild-eyed. "You said 2 exits." "I lied to them," Clara said, taking a turn without breaking stride. "To us, there's 3. She shouldered open a door that had learned to stick from centuries of damp. Cold river air hit them. Below, a narrow yard ran to a slip tunneled under the warehouses. A boat bobbed there, tied off with a sailor's contempt for land knots. "Borrowed," Clara said, "from a man who prints counterfeit sermons." She slashed the line, and they jumped. Behind them, barkers chimed with the alarms of men who loved barrels more than truth. The oars bit the water. Henley tucked the flour tin under his coat as if it were an infant. Above, smoke boiled into the river light, and the window where Clara had written whole governments into shame became a mouth of fire that ate its own words. "Don't look," Clara said, not unkindly. "We'll build another press if we live." Henley didn't look. He rowed. The slip carried them toward the black artery of the river, and the river took them the way a vein takes blood downstream toward the heart they meant to pierce. The bindery vault. The bindery on Wren Street had always been more careful than its trade required. The owner, Mrs. Severin, was a widow, with a spine like a book's and a voice that could cut paper. She worked for lawyers who wanted wills to last, and for preachers who wanted their pamphlets to survive being shoved in pockets next to flasks. She also worked for Clara when Clara needed a page to vanish. "I don't hide sins," Mrs. Severin said when they stumbled in river wet and ash-dusted. "I hide truths until truths are ready." "We're ready," Clara said simply. Mrs. Severin sniffed, waved them through the counter, and locked the door behind them with a key that looked like it remembered better locks. The vault was a half-moon of brick under the street, cool as a cellar and thrice as quiet. Lanterns hung in niches like patient moons. "You may speak," the widow said, "but don't lie. God hates it, and so do I." Ward spread the ledger, the cipher notes, the rail map. Abel set to making rubbings of the embossed seal on the ledger's flyleaf to show provenance if the book was seized. Henley's hands finally stopped shaking. When they found work, he took down names as Clara barked them cross-referenced dates, stitched citations to events like tailors, put seams through cloth. When the safe's door swung open, its belly held clean type cases and lead bars. Mrs. Severin made room at once, as if the vault itself approved. 36 hours is a luxury we no longer have, Clara said, checking her watch. We will print a broadsheet in 4 set handbills in 6 and push plates to every friend with a press by midnight. We carry them by hand because the postmaster drinks from Blackstone cups. She turned to Mrs. Severin. I'll pay for paper and screams if I have to. You'll pay in coin like always, the widow replied briskly, and you'll eat a bowl of soup before your blood forgets it's warm. They ate barely tasting. While spoons clinked, Mrs. Severin told a memory as if she were reading from it a fire 20 years prior at a boarding house where her sister had worked. The paper blamed a cooking lamp, but the fire ladders found the steps slicked with coal tar and the attic door ripped from hinges inward. Someone had barred it from the hall. The insurance man wept with us, and the landlord bought a new row on Laurel 2 weeks later. Your ledger will tell me why, and then you will tell everyone else. Abel returned from the street with a face that belonged to bad news. They're quiet, he said. Too quiet. The river road's thick with men standing as if waiting for a parade. No laughter, no cigarettes. The kind of quiet that says someone paid them to be angry later. Then we publish before they get their story straight, Clara said. We keep the original here. We carry the first proof to Father Moulton. He'll ring the chapel bell at the hour, and if money tries to silence that too, at least the sound will lodge in someone's rib cage. Ward laid his palm on the ledger's page again, as if salting it with his heat. If we're separated, you'll head for the telegraph in the post alley, Clara finished. I know your mind. I've been haunted by it for years. The corner of her mouth turned even now. Let's condemn some men to sunlight. The widow wound the vault clock and set a pot of paste to warm. The room smelled briefly of wheat and determination. Above them, a wagon rattled over the cobbles. It sounded like time itself hurrying. The first sheets fly. At 2:30, the bindery became a press room by fiat. Clara and Mrs. Severin worked the hand press like they were born to it, one heaving the bar, while the other fed dampened sheets. Abel hung each page from a cord to dry the room, shrouding itself in declarations. Ward checked each form for typos money would seize like a weapon. Henley proofed names again and again until the letters seemed to crawl. The headline was a blade. The Blackstone Ledger, How Disaster Paid a Dynasty. Beneath it, a map so stark that even a man who couldn't read numbers would feel implicated. They printed a first run of 500, then another. Abel bundled them with coarse string. Clara drafted a rota of runners, naming men and women Henley had never met, but who seemed to materialize out of paste and shadow, a midwife with arms like braided rope, a night watchman with winter lungs, a seamstress with feet silent as polite sin. Front of the cathedral, Clara told them. Market Square, the ferry landings, and tuck 20 under the door of the constable whose boy I delivered in July. He owes me 2 nights' sleep and a nerve. Henley took a stack and an address he recognized only by rumor. A Union Hall on the edge of the river wards, where men whose backs carried the city met to decide how much they would sell them for. Ward rolled his set into a canvas tube, tied it to his belt like a second spine. Meet at Moulton's bell, Clara said, squeezing Henley's wrist once in a gesture that meant something older than fear. They moved out by different doors. The city's cold had sharpened. Breath plumed from faces like speech. Henley walked fast, not running, because running is admission. At the first corner, a boy of 10 tried to snatch the top sheet because boys are magpies for mischief. Henley gave him one, and the boy's eyebrows climbed into his hair. "You selling?" the child asked. "Giving," Henley said, and the boy grinned like a fuse catching. "Then I'm a saint," he decided, and ran ahead, shoving a copy under every barred door. Somebody shouted half a block behind. Two somebodies replied. Henley lengthened his stride. At the Union Hall, a lamp burned in a window. He pushed through a knot of men whose faces told lives in shorthand. Busted knuckles, a missing ear, a scar that divided a brow like a plowshare. He spread the sheet on a table and let them come to it. They did as men will to a map of their own dispossession. Silence pulled tight. Then a voice. "My cousin, he died in that mill." A second, they paid Mary $12 to bury Will. A third, colder, returned chassis. Henley didn't lecture. He put a finger on the lines that mattered and said the names money had thought were safe inside a book. The hall changed temperature like a stove door opening. By the time he stepped back into the street, the city had already learned a new word and was practicing how to shout it. Broadsheets flapped in hands were read aloud to neighbors who couldn't read at all, were nailed to posts with knives. A dog trotted past with a corner of the headline in its teeth like a victory pennant. The air collected a new sound, a bell slow and deliberate. Father Moulton ringing noon as if noon were a verdict. And then the old city made its counter sound, the crack of batons on cobble, the crush of boots that didn't belong to any regiment. Henley knew, the shouted lie, riot that money keeps in its pocket for such weather. He tucked the empty canvas tube under his coat and turned toward the bell. Money's story. And the streets, the square, had been market at dawn. By noon it was a jury box without benches. Men climbed crates to read aloud. Women formed chains passing sheets down the alley mouths like water in a fire line. Above it all, the bell tolled, and every strike landed somewhere inside Henley like a hammer on a nail that had been waiting 10 years for this exact swing. Two lines formed at the square's north and south edges, one of citizens with faces red from cold and conviction. One of men paid to look like citizens and trained to behave like soldiers. The paid men held truncheons and carried the casual calm of those who believe the law loves them. Their captain, clean-coat, scar-mouth, stood on a box and raised gloved hands for silence that didn't come. He tried a different tactic. He gestured, and a carriage rolled into the square, lacquered black wheels, clean an absurdity among fish stalls and horse dung. The door opened, and a man stepped down whose face had never sweated for bread. Blackstone kin by the cut of him, if not the name. He had a voice designed for microphones the future hadn't quite invented. "Friends," he began, and the square laughed, because there are words that can't survive air they don't deserve. He let the smile slide. "Charleston thrives because we invest. We insure against calamity, not because we welcome it, but because we understand the world's caprices. Do not let yellow paper tell you your tragedies were orchestrated." He lifted a handbill that one of his men had plucked from a doorframe. "This is libel. The printers who made it will find no shelter in our courts." Henley felt, rather than saw, Ward move to his left, a shadow taking a second position. Clara had climbed the fishmonger's bench as if it were a pulpit, and held a single sheet over her head, not to wave, but to display. "This is an account book," she said, voice clear without shrillness. "It records payments, dates merchandise. It names the men who signed receipts. We will prove each line with a witness, each witness with a document, each document with a stamp you yourselves paid for. If you wish to sue, gentlemen, you will sue your own handwriting." A cheer went up that had nothing of riot in it, and everything of recognition. Scarmouth didn't flinch. He inclined his head, made a small circle with 2 fingers, and the line of paid men advanced. Not fast, never fast. Money prefers inevitable. The first baton struck a hand, not a head. The second hit a crate. People yielded, then surged, then locked elbows in a new geometry. Henley pulled a boy behind him and took a truncheon on his forearm that sang all the way to his teeth. The bell didn't stop. It rang and rang and rang, until the captain snarled at a runner who sprinted toward the church and vanished into the press of bodies that refused to part for him. Over the crowd's shoulder, Henley saw the strangest thing he'd ever seen in a city fight: a constable reading the broadsheet by the light reflected from a burning wagon, then folding it carefully and slipping it under his breastplate like a prayer. He met Henley's eyes and gave the smallest of nods, a man resigning from a war without leaving his post. Clara's voice cut through again. Names she called as if teaching school. Say them, remember them. 100 mouths answered, then 200, then 1,000. Names of the dead, names of the bought, names of children dragged from a mill's ash by neighbors, while a cousin of a cousin bought a new horse. Money hates names more than it hates numbers. Names can be loved. Scarmouth blew a whistle. The line pushed harder. Above the square, on the balcony of a bank, a figure stepped out, another black stone face, this one older cut from older money. He raised a hand, to calm, to soothe, to promise inquiry and fellowship. He misjudged the hour. A fishmonger's wife threw the first rotten lemon history ever truly deserved. It struck his lapel and slid, leaving a bright stain like a cheerful wound. The square laughed the way a man laughs when the surgeon says the word benign. Ward leaned to Henley's ear. "They'll break us in 4 and take the press by dusk. We need the next move." Henley touched the canvas tube at his side where hope and fear nested like snakes. "We cut their line," he said. "Not the men. The words. Telegraph." Ward smiled without humor. "Ink and teeth," he said again. "And wire. The wire and the knife." Charleston's telegraph office backed to an alley that had seen every kind of negotiation. The operator, a woman with hair the color of steel filings, looked up as Ward and Henley shouldered through. "Closed," she said, because the sign said it, and because saying it was armor. Ward laid a broadsheet and a coin on the counter. "Open," he replied gently, because the square had torn any pretense of calm from the air, and because gentleness is sometimes the only thing that can move a locked heart. She hesitated the length of a full breath, then slid the coin off the paper and into a drawer. 3 lines, she said. "And if anyone asks, I sent them for the weather. They wrote for power and speed, to Memphis commercial appeal. Stop to New York World, stop to Richmond Dispatch, stop have Blackstone ledger proving, systematic arson fraud murder, stop sending coded excerpts and scans, stop hold front page, stop prepare legal counsel, stop do not trust express, stop." They attached the first cipher keys and a rubbing of the seal. They included names of the dead in a list that read like music with hard notes. The operator's fingers danced the keys, turning accusation into lightning. Henley felt the hairs on his arms lift as if his blood recognized its own cousins in the wire. Ward stood with his back to the door, palming the baton he'd picked up from a fallen man in the square. Outside boot steps, not hurrying. The steps of men who know doors open because they have always opened. The latch turned. The operator didn't pause, not even when Scarmouth slid inside with two companions. Up close, his scar was uglier than distance allowed a puckered border around a mouth that had said too many low, soft things. He looked at Henley, then Ward, then the operator. He weighed whether to lie, decided it wasn't worth the air. "You're sending filth," he said. "Call your hands off the keys." The operator finished a sentence and eased her fingers to her lap. "I send what's set before me." She met his eyes levelly. "You want to stop a wire, cut it in the street." Scarmouth smiled without his scar participating. "Thank you for the lesson," he said, and nodded at one of his men who disappeared back into the sunlight to fetch pliers and a sole small enough to enjoy their use. Ward moved so little, Henley almost missed it, shifting weight to the ball of his left foot. Scarmouth saw it. He was a professional. "Don't," he said almost kindly. "Let's not turn a line clerk's afternoon into a murder trial." "Trial," Henley said, something hot and ridiculous loosening in his throat. "You don't use trials. You use ledgers." Scarmouth's eyes flicked to the broadsheet on the counter. "You made the mistake of giving the poor a myth that flatters them. They love that. It makes them think their suffering is not only meaningful, but marketable. You'll go far on that until the presses burn and the widows remember rent." Henley wanted in that moment to break the man's face against the counter until Bone learned humility. Instead, he reached for the wire with words. He looked to the operator. "How many seconds to cut a line?" he asked. 3, she said. 2 if the man isn't drunk. How many to finish our header and a line to each paper that proves you sent it before interference 1, she said, and the corners of her mouth ticked. "If no one knocks my elbow." Henley nodded. "Then send." She did, and the keys chattered like teeth in a good fight. Scarmouth sighed as if disappointed in a child and lifted his hand to signal the man outside. Ward moved, batoned the signal hand against the door frame so hard, bone met old oak with a sound like a judge's gavel. The second guard went for his own stick. Henley took him in the knee with the stool and felt the give of a joint that would talk about weather for the rest of its life. Scarmouth did not draw a gun to his credit or his strategic conservatism. He drew a knife short and clean better for alleys than squares. "Don't cut the woman," Ward said, not as a plea, as a promise of a different kind of afternoon. Scarmouth measured them both, measured the operator still working like a metronome, measured the sound of the crowd beginning to tilt outside toward something that could not be called riot if one loved words. Then he did the unexpected. He lowered the knife and stepped back. "Let Charleston have its hour," he said. "Trains run at night, and night loves us." He left with his injured men, and the door settled back into its frame as if it had never been asked to choose sides. The operator exhaled and wiped her palms on her skirt. "If they cut the wire down the block, the next message won't go," she said. But those went. Ward retrieved his breath and his baton. "That's all we needed for today." Henley looked at the fluttering tape where their words had become electricity. He pictured distant rooms, men and women leaning over desks in cities that had never heard of Stillwater Hollow, reading a headline that would make their hands cold and their coffee taste like ashes. He pictured trains in the night carrying more than passengers and a dynasty waking to find its bed full of glass. Today, he said, we gave the dead a mouth, and tomorrow, Ward replied, we give them teeth. Night trains. Night trains announce themselves long before they arrive. A tremor felt in teeth and crockery, a rattle in window sash that makes the house seem nervy. Ward and Henley stood in the bindery vault as the city's late freight began its iron murmur, and the ledger lay open to a page Henley had avoided without knowing why. The column headers were ordinary date consignee remarks, but the ink behaved oddly here, as if a different nib had been used, or a hand that wrote with two hearts. See the gaps, Ward said, tapping with a blunt forefinger. Spacing isn't random. It's telegraph rhythm dots and dashes in white space. Mrs. Severin's lamp hissed softly. Clara, chin in palm, narrowed her eyes. Show me. Ward laid thin strips of scrap between entries, shaping the ledger's empty breath into pattern. He marked long gaps as dashes short as dots, counted sets, grouped fives, then slid a paper across to Clara. She read under her breath, R-E-T-U-R, N-C-H-A-S-S-I-S-V-I-A, G-R-A-V-E-L-Y. She stopped, throat tight. Gravely. Gravely, Junction, Henley asked. He'd heard the name in river gossip and interchange out past the brickyards where 3 lines kissed and no one much liked to linger. Ward nodded. If chassis are what we suspect, the Junction is their washing place. Send it out on one line, make the mischief, bring it back through another so the arrival looks innocent. The ledger tells us when to be there. Clara checked her watch. 2 hours to midnight. Henley looked toward the ceiling as if he could see the sky. We can catch the yard throat from the river road in 40 minutes. If we want to see what return looks like with our eyes instead of theirs. Mrs. Severin folded her arms, the widow and the general, at once. If you go, you don't take the book. You take only what you can swallow or burn. Agreed, Ward said. He copied the relevant lines, dates, car numbers, consignee initials onto a scrap. He then chewed once and spit into Clara's palm. She smiled, despite herself, wrapped the wet scrap in oilskin and tucked it into her boot. We'll fetch our proof, she said, rising. Abel met them at the door, cheeks bright with either cold or purpose. There's movement in the alleys, he warned. Leftovers from the square, but the river road's open enough. If you go now, you'll step between their sentences. They went. Charleston's midnight had a scraped, raw feeling as if the city had cried and wasn't done. The bell had finally fallen silent. The silence afterward felt like the breath between verdict and sentence. Street lamps smeared their golden coins thin on slick corbels. Down by the brickyards, the world turned to geometry, black rectangles of kilns, pale parallelograms of clay yard, the long shining curve of rail. And beneath it all, the ground hum that makes a man wish his bones had been hammered differently. Gravely, Junction was both smaller and uglier than the mind imagines. A switchman's hut tilted like a drunk. 3 points converging like fingers about to pinch. A signal mast with a red glass that should have been replaced 2 winters ago. They hunkered behind a stack of sewer tiles and watched the Junction breathe. First came a local drag lumber and salt pork, a coach with its shades down, someone coughing inside. Then a coal string hoppers like black coffins without lids. Then, punctual as a sin that's been practiced, the 3-car consist marked in the ledger, a ventilated box car with its louvers wired open, a flat with a tarped load taller than a man, and a caboose so clean it looked like it had been polished with oiled pride. What's under the tarp? Abel whispered. Something that doesn't like heat but loves air, Ward said, or something that sweats. The consist eased in. A lantern blinked a sequence, 2 short, 1 long, that matched the white space code Ward had extracted. The junction man a shadow with a cap through the points. The train kissed a siding with a sigh. Men stepped from the caboose. Not dock brawlers, technicians. Gloves. Caps. One carried a clipboard with the reverence of a sacrament. They didn't unload. They inspected bolts and straps, then the underside of the flat as if searching for ticks. One man knelt by the brake wheel and scratched a mark on the metal with a wax pencil G over a triangle. Clara's fingers found Henley's sleeve and tightened. "I've seen that mark," she whispered. On a ladder, 2 blocks from the mill. The week before, it burned. The clipboard man looked up as if he could hear her thought. He turned his face and the light took it. Scar mouth hatless, the seam of damage stark. He gave a small, satisfied nod to no one visible, then climbed the caboose steps and shut its door with a soft, proprietary click. "Proof," Ward breathed, "and a throat to cut. But some throats are wrapped in iron." The bindery siege dawn came with an anvil's fatigue. Mrs. Severin's shop opened to a crowd that wasn't customers. Men in coats too fine for paste and too thin for weather fanned across Wren Street, making a shape a tactician would call a net and a housewife would call bad luck. At their center, a deputy marshal with a writ rolled like a sermon. The paper was city-sealed. The signature crawled like a snake. By order of the court, the deputy-called voice lacquered with official calm. "We search these premises for stolen property and seditious material." Mrs. Severin unlocked the door and stepped into the frame like a lintel-grown bones. "You search nowhere in my house unless you arrive with a key older than mine," she said. "And if that writ says stolen property, it can find itself." The deputy held up his hands. "Ma'am, I sympathize." "No, you don't," she said, and turned her back on him in a way that would have gotten a lesser woman arrested out of pique alone. "Clara," she called. "Tea." Inside the vault hummed with the work of people who had decided to be tireless until their hearts persuaded them otherwise. Claire looked to Ward. "We can hold the door for an hour, maybe 2 if the neighbors hate them, but they'll get a locksmith and a judge with a breakfast grudge." Ward spread the city map next to the ledger, as if geography were just another column waiting to be balanced. "We split the risk," he said. "The original stays here. We pull the second quire the pages with the Gravely code and move them by hand to a place so dull no one would dream of looking there." Dull, Abel asked. "City archives," Clara said, grinning without joy. "Basement vault under the assessor's office. Boxes of tax ledgers nobody living has read. The clerk owes me, his mistress likes my columns, and his wife likes my recipes." Mrs. Severin turned from the peephole. "They brought a locksmith and a man who likes locks for the wrong reasons. You've got 10 minutes before the professional curiosity turns to professional pride." Ward slid the extracted pages into a portfolio thin enough to hide under a newspaper. Henley tucked it beneath his coat. Clara inked her hands and pressed the ledger's seal onto the portfolio's inside flap. "Authenticity," she said. "If they take it, they'll know what they missed." At the back, a small door opened onto an even smaller alley that had learned to be mean. Abel went first with a sack of waste paper to sell the pretense. Henley followed with the portfolio and a pouch of type that clinked like a drunk's pockets. Clara brought up the rear with nothing visible but her nerve. Mrs. Severin barred the door behind them and returned to her front counter to argue theology with the law. They moved fast. Twice Henley lifted a paper to his face like a commuter and let paid eyes slide off him. Once Clara stopped so suddenly he ran into her. She'd seen a hat she recognized on a head she didn't want to die near. They crossed the square at its sleepy hour, when anger hasn't yet remembered itself, and ducked into the assessor's vestibule, a marble pretender to grandeur with a floor that smelled faintly of mop and mischief. The clerk, a reed of a man with a mustache that apologized for his face, took one look at Clara, one at the portfolio, and unlocked a door with shaking hands. "I never saw you," he said. "Twice." Thrice Clara said and kissed him on the cheek with the air in it, then disappeared down a stair into the cool, bureaucratic dark. Behind them, 3 streets away, Wren Street learned what a pry bar can do that a writ will not. The second, Cypher's teeth. The archive vault felt like a church where God had moved out. Boxes, shelves, ledgers that slept through wars. Clara laid the portfolio on a table and slipped the Gravely pages free. "We'll hide the copies here under 3 inches of boredom," she said, "then take rubbings of the code and walk those to 3 different city desks. If they kill one to sing." Ward ran a finger down the white space scansion again. "It's not just Gravely," he murmured. "Look, page headers shift every 7 entries. The empty rhythm spells car numbers, and this margin scratch, see how the ink shines differently. That's not iron gall. That's aniline. Newer." Someone added a postscript after the fact. Henley angled the lamp. In the gutter of the ledger, almost shy letters emerged. RBD31. Railway Board, docket. 31, he said, is reporter's bones rousing. A hearing, 2 years back, on safety apparatus in urban conflagrations. "I covered the opening day, and then a typhus outbreak ate my week." He closed his eyes, trying to see a room he had barely noticed then. A Boston man spoke. Crisp suit, southern vowels shaved. He argued for standardized housings for mobile pump frames so they could be moved for demonstration. He showed a prototype. Shiny like a villain's tooth. "Name?" Clara asked. "Went by Mr. Black, because if the devil ever learned irony, he moved to America. But an aide slipped once and called him Mr. R.A. Henley's mind sorted card files only he could see. Rowan Blackstone, the cousin who plays inventor." Ward grunted. "So docket 31 green lights the chassis. The ledger maps its travel, Gravely launders it, and Charleston burns when it's convenient." Clara slid the pages back into their nest with a tenderness she'd reserve for a child. "We will publish the docket, the map, and the photograph of Rowan Blackstone standing next to his shiny toy. If it kills him, and if it kills us, the dead will be loud." She looked toward. "We need the docket." Henley lifted his eyes to the ceiling as if the board's files lived in the plaster. "Board office keeps copies on the 2nd floor of the old customs house." He checked his watch. "If we move before lunch, the clerk who sleeps with the senior stenographer will be out buying cigars and conscience powder." They hid the Gravely copies where taxes go to fossilize, tucked beneath Assessment's Dockside Ward, 1872-1878. Clara blew out the lamp and locked the door. When they reached the vestibule again, the mustached clerk looked paler than before. "Bad news?" Clara asked gently. He swallowed. "Wren Street's window broken. They took Mrs. Severin. Not to jail, to the big house on Laurel." He said big house the way a boy says wolf. And the locksmith who opened your door. He's my brother. Clara's face did something complicated, pain, then calculation, then the kind of fury that learns to write. We'll get her back, she said, a promise she had no right to make and every intention to keep. She touched the clock's sleeve. We will also print your brother's name if he does that work again. He nodded, tears large and foolish. He won't. Ward's jaw flexed. Change of order, he said. We split again. Henley and I fetch the docket and whatever we can steal from customs. Clara. He looked at her as if calculating the tensile strength of hope. You find someone whose badge still means oath. We'll need a warrant strong enough to walk through the black stone door. I know one, she said. He's meaner than his uniform and owes me over a child who lived. She wiped her palms on her skirt and squared her shoulders. We'll pull on 2 ropes at once and hope the same tree falls. Customs house and a photograph. The old customs house owned the river like a memory of empire. Its pillars had seen more oaths than any church in Charleston, many of them bad. Ward and Henley climbed the side stair behind a man carrying a crate of quail eggs, useful camouflage. The second-floor corridor smelled of sun-warmed ink and the faint, dead sweetness of pasted paper. At the board clerk's door, Henley knocked like a man come to flirt with a stenographer. A woman with hair in a severe coil and eyes that had given up on surprise opened to half-width. We're closed, she began, then saw Henley's face and remembered his byline. Unless you brought scandal. I brought its skeleton, Henley said. He pitched his voice into the playful register that gets doors not slammed. Docket 31. I need a look before lunch steals your afternoon. Her mouth tried not to smile and failed a little. You have 10 minutes and the understanding that if anyone asks you are never handsomer than you are this moment, and you are never here. Both are almost true, he said, and slid past. The file room was order weaponized shelves, labeled like lies boxes squared with lethal neatness. The clerk found docket 31 without looking because she'd made the system and thus owned it. She dropped the heavy book on a side table. The first page greeted them in type, hearing on mobile apparatus for fire abatement. The sign-in sheet below in hand Rowan black illegible representing consolidated apparatus and improvements. Henley felt the small thrill of a guess made real. Ward scanned faster than men should. Minutes, attachments. Here plates. The clerk slid a cardboard sleeve free and revealed 3 albumin photographs mounted on gray. The first showed a bright contraption on a flat car, immaculate as a buck's antlers. The second caught Rowan, half-turned face-sharp hair, too tidy for the world. The third was better, a rear angle, revealing housings couplings, the numbered chassis plate, RCI 7. Ward breathed, We have him. Henley's hands shook as he held the plate to the window and let the December light turn the silver brown to life. He could smell the albumin egg in chemistry and the faint guilt that clings to images of wicked men. Photographer's imprint, W.R. Klein State House Arcade. He'll have the glass negatives, Henley said. If we can print a broadsheet plate from them, they can sue till their teeth dull. The picture will already be in kitchens. Ward slid the plates back, then hesitated, then didn't. He lifted the third photograph, the rear angle, and slipped it under his shirt. The clerk saw the theft weighted against the hour and decided she had never learned arithmetic. 5 minutes, she said to the hallway. In the outer office, a young man in sleeves held 3 messages and a face full of nerves. For you, he told the clerk. She read, frowned, looked at Henley. City jail is full of men with bruised heads and empty pockets. Laurel Street Mansion posted a list of names to be questioned. Your printer's on it. So are you. Ah, Henley said mildly. They've given us fame. Get out, she said with sudden urgent kindness, and tell your Mrs. Severin I still have the ribbon from her wedding book. It won't be cut for them. They exited by the back stair, just as two policemen in crisp blues and bad minds entered by the front. On the landing, Ward palmed the photograph flat against his chest, feeling the cold image like a medal. Klein's studio, he said. We need the negative. And then Henley answered, we need a friend with a badge and a temper, an oath with teeth. Captain Isaiah Boone wore his uniform like a dare. Broad shoulders, boots that had known real mud eyes that had read warrants like scripture and men like recipes. Clara found him at the end of a corridor that smelled of stale coffee and rust, with his hat on a hook and his sleeves rolled to elbows the color of old oak. When she told him Mrs. Severin had been taken under a paper written by a judge who had once sent Boone's cousin to prison for stealing his own wages, back something quiet in the captain's face, woke up and asked for a knife. You want a raid? Boone said, not as a question. I want a rescue, Clara answered. And while you're there, I want you to find a locked room where men keep ledgers that belong to the people they burned. Boone's jaw worked. You know what happens when I go through that door. I'm a captain in the morning and a night watchman by supper time. I know, Clara said, and laid the broadsheet on his desk with a photograph they'd just stolen from the board tucked inside like a confession. And you also know what happens if you don't. He looked from the headline to the image of Rowan Blackstone smiling his long smile next to his toy. Boone wasn't a reader by nature, but he loved pictures because they left men fewer places to hide. I'll need a warrant with a spine, he said. The judge who signs it needs to hate them more than he hates you. Clara's mind sorted its address book like a gambler shuffling marked cards. Judge Pritchard. He buries bootleggers not because he's honest, but because they stole his nephew. He's sober in the morning and meaner by lunch. We've got an hour. Boone reached for his holster, then for his pen. I'll take 12 men I trust, and 12 I can afford to lose. We move while the city still smells like its own courage. They went to the judge in tandem, Clara, carrying the argument, Boone, the promise. Pritchard listened with his face like a cupboard with one hinge busted, read the broadsheet twice, peered at the photograph, and then did a thing that startled even himself. He signed a warrant naming names that money considered unprintable. You are not righteous people, he told them, but you are useful to the hour. If you die, I'll deny knowing you. If you live, I'll deny needing you. Boone saluted with 2 fingers and left with his men before Pritchard's ink had settled. Clara sent a runner to Klein's studio with a note and a $20 bill. Hold negative number 3. Do not sell, do not open your door to anyone with shinier shoes than a priest. Then she took a breath she'd been earning all day and hurried toward Laurel Street. On the ride, Boone briefed we go in on the service drive. 1 team to the side door, 1 to the back. We seize paper, first people, second guns, never unless they fire. We keep our language fine until a man earns vulgar. He looked at Clara and surprised her by adding, You don't come inside. I'm not a tourist, she said. You're a witness, he corrected. It's your word they'll try to unmake. I need it unscratched. She wanted to argue. Instead, she nodded once the surrender born of strategy rather than fear. The mansion rose ahead, a row house grown middle-aged, and corrupt curtains like fat tongues, brass-polished as if guilt could be buffed. Boone drew his men up and broke them into twos, gave the quiet order, and the first good law the city had seen in months walked toward a rich man's door. Laurel Street opens and closes. Laurel Street had never expected to be surprised. It was a block that believed in schedules, receipts, monograms. Surprises were for other wards. Boone rang the bell. A butler opened with a face that belonged to a far better house. Boone placed the warrant in his gloved hands as one might hand a newborn to a clumsy uncle. Marshal's office. We are here for records under the names Blackstone Consolidated, Consolidated Apparatus and Improvements, and any entity dealing in fire, flood, or accident. The butler read without changing expression. Please wait in the vestibule, he said, which is how the rich spell store. Boone stepped forward instead. Step aside, he said, and the butler's professionalism met the warrant's ink and broke. Inside, the entry smelled of beeswax and male perfume. Scar Mouth appeared at the head of the stair with the ease of a host who keeps odd hours. He had changed coats and expressions. Captain, he said pleasantly, you should have come at night. We entertain then. Afternoon's fine, Boone replied, moving men to flanking positions with the same tone a grocer uses to order cabbages. We're here for the room that hums when you lie about it. Scar Mouth's laugh was small. Rooms don't hum, Captain. People do. He looked past Boone to Clara on the stoop and lifted 2 fingers in something that would have been a salute if he'd ever worn anything requiring honor. Miss Judd, always a pleasure to watch you attempt non-fiction. Boone didn't look back. He looked right. Sullivan Pantry. Rushback stairs. Gauge with me. He mounted the steps like a man returning to a place he'd once been whipped and intended to redecorate. Scar Mouth retreated, not fleeing, simply measuring. The house had too many doors. That's how such houses defend themselves, confusion masquerading as taste. Boone opened the first 3 with his shoulder, then with Sullivan's pry bar, storage smoking room, a library that had never been read in. On the 4th door he paused, not because it was locked, but because it pretended not to be. He laid his palm to it. Cool. He listened. Somewhere below a motor whispered. Here, he said, and Gage set the hinges screaming. The room beyond smiled with steel. Racks, cabinets, a drafting table with precise cruelty laid out in blue pencil. A wall of index drawers labeled with innocent words, Plum Pitch Pulley, and in a row that ran like a fault line, Claims River, Claims Urban, Claims Mill. In the corner, a cabinet with a grill front breathed faint warm air that smelled of hot varnish. Paper, Boone said. Take it all. His men moved with greedy efficiency, the good greed of law, hungry at last. Scar Mouth leaned in the doorway. You'll choke on it, he said lightly. Information is dry going down. Not if you soak it in your wine. Clara snapped from the hall. Boone should have sent her back to the stoop. He didn't. She had the camera she used when the photographer wouldn't come, and she clicked it. The bright powder flash bleaching the room for a heartbeat. Scar Mouth blinked annoyed at losing composure for even an instant. Gage opened the warm cabinet and swore softly. Inside, metal frames small and nested the kind of housings that might cradle pumps or something else that likes burning where it chooses. Each bore a stamped plate RCI followed by a number. Boone lifted one with 2 hands. It had the balance of a well-made lie. Downstairs a shout cut through. Back door Sullivan's voice. The sound of scuffling. A lamp broke, a woman screamed Mrs. Severin's voice, not pain rage. Boone looked at Scarmouth and saw the man's eyes flick a quarter-inch to the left, toward a panel that was not a panel. Gage saw it too. He crossed the room in 3 long steps and slammed his baton against the wood. Hollow. He hit again. Something beneath them coughed a machine exhale, and the panels sprang an inch. Ward, who had appeared at the landing with a face that said he'd run here through 3 streets of bad decisions, shoved from the hall side, and the panel opened enough to show stairs and light that wasn't daylight. Boone went first because some men are made to die in front if dying is required. The stairs corkscrewed down into a room colder than the season. Shelves, boxes, ledgers. The real belly. He lifted the nearest book and opened to a page of names so precise it felt like a sin. "We have you," he said not loudly. Upstairs, Scarmouth smiled small and awful. For a minute he agreed. Enjoy it. Minutes are all anybody ever owns. Then the house performed its oldest trick. Something deep kicked gears, engaged, and a door somewhere slammed. Gage yelled, cut off. Smoke punched into the stairwell from a vent they hadn't seen. The cold room's door sucked shut with the force of a ship's bulkhead. Boone swore like a credible sailor and shouldered it. It didn't move. Above, Scarmouth's voice floated down as benign as tea. "You asked for a room that hums," he called. "You found the house's throat. The arrest that doesn't stick." Boone didn't panic. He swore, then counted. Smoke calls for arithmetic. How many breaths? How many men? How many feet to the door? He dropped to a knee where the air is lazier, bellowed back up, and the men reversed in practiced misery. The cold room yawned behind them like the best sin they'd ever found. They climbed. Clara, at the threshold, jammed a scarf under the jamb to blunt the smoke's appetite. Ward shouldered the panel fully open and held it with a boot, while Boone and Gage spilled into the corridor like the world had pushed. Vent Ward coughed, pointing. There. A grill high on the wall burped grey. Boone unloaded 2 rounds into it because sometimes lid is a form of persuasion. The grill popped loose. Smoke thinned to an angry veil. "Arrest him," Clara said, voice flat and surgical. She pointed at Scarmouth as if identifying a contagion under glass. Boone's badge and warrant had come to do a polite search. The hour had turned them into something older. He crossed the space between himself and the black stone lieutenant, as if no carpet, no law, no decorum existed. He took Scarmouth's wrist, spun him, and clicked iron on bone with the relief of a man finally getting to close a book. Samuel Harrow, Boone said, first time anyone had named the man in a room since the scar was new. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction. You can find the rest in the warrant or in hell." Harrow did not struggle. He looked curious. "Captain Boone," he said, "I misjudged your appetite." Boone shoved him toward the door. In the vestibule, Mrs. Severin stood hair wild, a bruise rising on one cheek but unbroken. She held a paperweight that would have killed a normal man if it had connected. Crumbs of glass on the floor suggested she'd been aiming correctly, but had met a skull acquainted with trouble. She saw Boone's prisoner and smiled like a winter sun. "You look worse with bracelets," she told Harrow. Neighbors crowded the stoop. Their faces were a choir with too many notes: hope, hunger, disbelief. Boone raised his voice for them. "Samuel Harrow, agent of Blackstone Consolidated," he declared, letting the titles do work. taken under warrant on evidence obtained lawfully. The square, this smaller, richer square, made a sound like a first breath after a long dunking. 3 things then happened, almost together. First, a carriage bearing a Blackstone lawyer rounded the corner at the exact speed money uses when it pretends not to run. Second, a magistrate with hair like white hay and a face like a slapped ham waddled from the carriage behind it, clutching papers that smelled like midnight and old whiskey. Third, a patrol sergeant who did not belong to Boone's team and did belong to the same lodge as the magistrate stepped in front of the captain and said too pleasantly, "We'll take it from here." Boone's hand tightened on the cuff chain until the metal sang. "You'll take nothing but an order," he said. The magistrate cleared his throat with ceremony. "Captain Boone," he said, "writ of habeas corpus. Mr. Harrow's seizure is irregular. Your warrant defective, your search beyond scope." He handed Boone a paper with ink still dreaming of being dry. "Remand the prisoner to my custody forthwith." Clara moved before Boone did stepping between the paper and the man. "Your Honor," she said, tasting the second word like poison. "Do you often pre-write your judgments and bring them to the scene of the crime?" The neighbors laughed in that low way a crowd laughs when it just learned it has knives. Harrow's mouth flicked. He enjoyed live theater. Boone read the writ because he still believed in reading. It was filthy and careful, full of words chosen to sound like fairness. He looked up at the magistrate, then at the lawyer, then at the sergeant whose hand had drifted to his club, as if hands have their own small appetites. "No," Boone said simply, and the porch chilled. The lawyer stepped forward, smooth as a seal. Captain No Boone repeated louder, "This arrest stands. We found a room your warrant would never see. We seized evidence your paper was never going to sign. We did the job you refused to do because your dinners are better when these men pay for the wine." That almost did it. The crowd tipped toward him. Then the sergeant, flustered by being talked to like a man made a mistake, he grabbed Boone's sleeve. Boone's fist answered on reflex. The sergeant stumbled, surprised by the existence of gravity. The magistrate bleated. And in that small disorder, the Blackstone lawyer did the only skill he truly had. He made a signal no one taught him, and 2 men in plain clothes, men who had been leaning on a stoop pretending to be bored, stepped in fast, cut the chain between Harrow's cuffs with a pocket saw, and moved him like a piano. Quick, careful, practiced. Boone pivoted, but you can't grab 3 men at once in a hallway designed to make poor men feel clumsy. Henley lunged and caught Harrow's sleeve. The fabric tore with a rude, satisfying sound. The man didn't slow. Clara flung her camera. It cracked against the door jamb and fell guts out, a sacrifice none of them would forget. By the time Boone reached the top step, Harrow's boots were in the carriage and the door was shutting with the delicate snick of money buying time. The horses leapt. The carriage careened. Mrs. Severin lifted the paperweight again as if she could throw a house. Boone swore in a register that made children blink. Clara, panting, pressed the torn cuff to her breast like a relic. Not nothing, she said through her teeth. Not nothing. Boone stared down the street at the carriage that was already turning into rumor. "No," he said, voice low as a vow. He touched the warrant in his pocket, the photograph under Ward's shirt, the weight of a city's hour in his hands. "It's the first step that never sticks. The second one does." He looked back at the house, at the panel ajar, at the faint smoke unwinding from the vent like a promise. "We go again," he said. and louder Clara added, and wider Henley finished. Out on laurel curtains trembled, in alleys runners flew. Over the river a night train blew, two short, one long. The ledger weighted pages, breathing tinily in the bindery vault that had learned this week how to pray. The ledger's second language. The fire cracked in the grate as Ward laid the ledger flat on the table, hands moving with surgical precision. See this. He tapped the neat columns where dates, names, and towns were listed. Every third letter isn't a letter at all, it's a cipher mark. Look at the spacing. Henley leaned closer, the paper yellowed at the edges, the ink browned to sepia. With each careful note, Ward jotted into a small pad the bland insurance records transformed into a lattice of hidden instructions, shipment routes that matched troop train schedules, warehouse inventories that lined up with epidemic outbreaks, and codes for expendable assets that sent a cold shiver through Henley's bones. By midnight, one truth was clear. The Blackstones hadn't merely been killing for profit. They'd been engineering disasters on demand, bending entire markets to their will. The ledger wasn't just evidence, it was a map of their entire machine. Reach beyond Pennsylvania, Ward flipped to the back where a separate index contained only numbers. He cross-referenced it against railroad freight logs, and the pattern snapped into focus. The Blackstones had ties to lines in Ohio, Illinois, Missouri, even territories farther west where telegraph wires hadn't yet reached. This isn't just Pennsylvania, Ward said. They've got eyes and hands in half the country. Mines, mills, grain routes, every point where a disaster would mean a payout. If they lose one line, they've got 5 more to lean on. Henley rubbed his jaw, the enormity settling in. Bringing them down would mean more than just turning the ledger over. They'd need to burn the whole network at once, or the family would rebuild before the ink dried on any indictment. The ledger is missed. They didn't have to wait long for the Blackstones to notice. 2 nights after the break-in, a carriage arrived at the estate in the dead of night, the clatter of hooves echoing across the frozen ground. Ward's contact in the stables sent word by morning the household was on lockdown, guards doubled, every servant questioned. Worse, Henley spotted a man in the crowd at the Merrow's Ford Market, watching him from behind a stall of winter apples. The silver crest on his lapel was gone, but Henley recognized the set of his jaw. The rider from the bridge. They know, Henley said when he got back to the safe house, and they're moving. Fire in the walls. It happened at 3 a.m., the smell of smoke sharp and sudden. Henley woke to see the far wall glowing orange, the dry wood crackling under the heat. Ward was already at the window, swearing under his breath. They torched it. The fire spread fast, fed by something that burned hotter than lamp oil. Henley grabbed the ledger and Ward's cipher notes, shoving them into a canvas satchel as Ward kicked open the back door. But when they stumbled into the snow, 2 figures stepped from the tree-lined shotguns in hand. Narrow escape. Ward dropped low firing once into the snow at their feet. The distraction was enough. They broke left, plunging into the dark line of pines. Shots cracked behind them, splintering bark. Henley's lungs burned in the cold as they pushed uphill, the satchel thumping against his ribs. They didn't stop until the glow of the burning safe house was just a smear in the distance, the smell of smoke still in their clothes. Ward spat into the snow. We just lost our bolt hole. From now on, we're ghosts. An unexpected ally. They holed up in the hayloft of an abandoned barn outside a rail stop called Silver Bend. There, Henley wrote a coded message, and left it under a loose board in the telegraph office, an old dead drop he hadn't touched in years. The reply came 2 days later, 3 words in block capitals. "Maybe I owe you." That night, a tall, sharp-faced woman appeared at the barn door, her coat dusted with snow. "Henley," she said, voice like gravel. "You look worse than the last time I saw you. That's saying something." Her name was Clara Dane, a former Pinkerton who'd once taken a bullet meant for Henley during a warehouse sting in Chicago. If she'd come, it meant she was ready to fight, turning the ledger into a weapon. Around a lantern's small circle of light, the 3 of them went to work. Clara brought contacts, reporters, sympathetic lawmen, even a railroad foreman willing to falsify manifests for their cause. Ward continued decoding now with Clara's sharper memory for operational details, filling gaps in the ledger's patterns. The plan began to take shape. Leak small, undeniable pieces of the ledger's content to newspapers in multiple states simultaneously, each article hitting a different branch of the Blackstone machine. If they struck everywhere at once, the family wouldn't know where to plug the holes first. Henley looked at them both, the satchel open on the hay between them. "We've got one shot at this. When it starts, they'll come at us harder than they ever have." Clara smiled thinly. "Then let's make sure it hurts." The first spark. They worked in shadows and whispers. Ward packaged each segment of the ledger's contents into neat, self-contained bites, dates, payouts, and disasters tied together in a way even the most cautious editor couldn't ignore. Clara handled the distribution, dispatching envelopes via trusted couriers who rode under false names and switched trains at odd junctions. By the end of the week, the machine was in motion. Small-town presses in Missouri, Illinois, and Ohio received identical packages, each bearing a different postmark. No one paper had the whole story, but together they painted a picture that would be impossible to dismiss once the right eyes compared the dots. Henley stood in the barn loft, watching snow swirl in the lantern glow, and knew it was only a matter of time before the Blackstone struck back. The difference was, this time they wouldn't be able to smother the fire before it spread. Headlines in the wind. The first article hit in Columbus rail fire, linked to insurance fraud. Local mill owners questioned. A day later, another in St. Louis mine collapse survivors speak. Compensation, delays under investigation. Each piece contained precise numbers, uncanny coincidences, and enough insider detail to suggest the source was someone close to the industry. By the time a paper in Chicago printed Blackstone family rumors resurface amid rail sabotage allegations, the pattern was emerging. People began to talk in taverns and station houses, repeating names and dates. Ward brought a stack of these clippings back to the barn, his grin sharp. "We've got their attention now. Every man they've bought in the press is going to be working overtime. The Blackstones move." The counterattack was swift. By the 3rd week, rival articles began appearing, stories painting the victims as reckless, suggesting the disasters were accidents or hinting at a smear campaign against one of Pennsylvania's most respected families. More dangerous than ink, though, were the men who began showing up. Henley spotted them first in Cincinnati, 2 in overcoats, shadowing a reporter he'd briefed. Then in Quincy, where Clara noticed the same rider at 3 different crossings. The Blackstones were pulling strings on both coasts now, and those strings were wrapped around men with steady trigger fingers. Life on the move. They couldn't stay in one place for more than a night. Boarding houses, barns, the back rooms of sympathetic saloon keepers, any roof would do, so long as it changed by dawn. Clara kept her revolver, close sleeping light as a fox. Ward carried the ledger in a false bottom case, swapping satchels every few stops to confuse any trail. Henley learned to read the rhythm of pursuit, how the footsteps in a street might quicken when they passed, how conversations dipped when they entered a room. The hunt had become a game of hours, not days, a betrayal. It happened in a rail town called Durban. They'd been staying in the loft above a cooper's shop, courtesy of a man Ward swore was a loyal contact. But when Henley came back from the telegraph office, he found the place empty. Clara's coat gone, Ward's case overturned. A single scrap of paper lay on the floor, scrawled with one word, "Run." From the alley below came the shuffle of boots too many to count, and the low murmur of men trying not to be heard. Someone had sold them out, and the black stones were closing in, the rail yard chase. Henley slipped out the back, cutting through the maze of stacked barrels to the rail yard. Lantern light bobbed among the freight cars as voices called to one another. He caught a glimpse of Ward and Clara ahead, darting between boxcars. Shouts erupted. Henley vaulted a coupling, boots slipping on ice, and felt the wind of a bullet pass his ear. Clara fired back once the shot echoing against the iron hulls. They didn't stop until they found a flat car loaded with topped crates climbing aboard, just as the train began to lurch forward. The night swallowed the yard behind them, but Henley knew it wasn't over. An unexpected edge. 2 towns later, they met a man waiting on the platform, a broad-shouldered figure with coal dust still in his hair. He handed Clara a folded sheet without a word. Inside was a list names of Blackstone agents, their travel routes, and their paymasters. "Friend in the telegraph office intercepted it," the man said. "Figured you might put it to use." Ward scanned it, his eyes alight. This is their roster, every man they've got in the field. For the first time in weeks, Henley felt something other than exhaustion. They weren't just running anymore. They had a way to hit back hard. The roster's pulse. They spread the roster across a boarding house table whose varnish had bubbled under too many kerosene lamps. Names, routes, and paymasters formed a web of arrows and circled towns. Ward tapped a column of initials, MBSDRK men who recurrently appeared next to rail junctions and river ports where the ledger's trails went darkest. "Field captains," he said. "If we cut them loose from the tree, the branches stop moving." Clara went quiet in that particular way of hers, the way she did when Scale entered the room. "We don't have an army," she said, "just 3 pairs of boots, and 1 pair is wearing thin." She lifted her gaze to Henley. "But we do have time if we make them waste theirs." Henley drew a map over the roster with pencil and string ovals around telegraph hubs where gossip traveled faster than steam. "We don't fight them everywhere. We set 3 tables and force them to sit where we choose. They picked the ground Evansville where the Ohio bent around a telegraph yard thick with Union men. Sandusky, whose lakeshore warehouses were the Blackstone's discreet way stations, and Altoona, the rail's iron heart, where a single signalman could misroute a regiment. They drafted letters under assumed names, bait for the field captain's promises of a witness ready to recant a burned ledger page that never quite burned a deputy willing to lose evidence for the right price. Ward handled the ciphers. Clara memorized train times. Henley settled the question none of them voiced. If they had to choose between exposure and survival, they would choose exposure. The ledger's truth, once public, could live longer than any of them. Before dawn, they mailed the hooks from 3 different towns and bought 3 different coats. By evening, the board was set. A roster is just a heartbeat written sideways, Henley thought. If you press 2 fingers in the right place, the pulse falters. Smoke and mirrors. The first captain, R.K., arrived in Evansville with a limp he tried to hide and a hat that hid nothing. He took a back table at the Falcon House and ordered stew he did not eat, waiting for a contact who would never come. Clara sat 3 tables down, her hair pinned in the tidy style of a telephone operator, and a ledger page folded into her muff blank paper, roughened with soot and dipped in vinegar to look 30 years old. Ward had seeded the room earlier with men who liked to talk. A freight clerk complained to a friend loudly about the fool operator who nearly sent a hazardous cargo into the river. A printer bragged about how quick he could turn a broadsheet if someone paid cash. R.K.'s eyes made a circuit of the tavern, pausing each time the name Blackstone slipped like a nail onto the floorboards. Henley stood outside under a drizzle that made 1,000 different Evansvilles in the window glass. When Clara rose to leave, R.K. rose too. She let him shadow her to the telegraph office, let him watch her slip an envelope across the counter to a boy in brass button sleeves, let him catch the name on the return address, J. Avery Parish Records. Father Avery resurrected as bait. R.K. bit. He sent a frantic wire to Pittsburgh Hold Courier, item in play, possible clergy witness. Ward intercepted it courtesy of a night operator who owed him 2 winters' whiskey. Within an hour, 3 more agents were en route to Evansville, their schedules staggered, their caution siphoned off by urgency. When they arrived, the witness had boarded a boat upriver under a false name. The agents followed in a hired launch whose boiler had been repaired by a union mechanic with a deep affection for stalls. Night fell. Timetables slipped. Money bled. By morning, R.K. was still staring at a door that never opened, and understanding finally that he'd been made to wait. The Blackstone's pulse faltered 1 beat late, then 2, turning a knife. Sandusky smelled of lake salt and cold iron, its docks a thicket of masts and whispering rigging. The second captain, S.D., used to be a riverman, which meant he trusted water more than men, and trusted bad weather most of all. Henley wanted S.D. not dead, but decisionless. That was Clara's art. They chose Warehouse 4, a bland brick building with a ledger's worth of secrets, false back rooms, straw-stuffed crates with ocean bills of lading, and a sub-basement wide enough to roll a wagon. Ward bribed a watchman with a story about missing ballots and $3 silver. By midnight, the trio owned the building's keys and the order of its footsteps. Clara met S.D. in the alley, carrying a fisherman's tin and a face like someone sent to collect what she didn't want to touch. "Message for you," she said, and let him see the topmost page. A list of dock workers and their pay envelopes stamped with the Blackstone crest she'd learned to counterfeit, using lamp-black beeswax and a coin rubbed through muslin. S.D. paled. She let him take the sheet and keep it. They led him gently into Warehouse 4's glow. Henley entered through the side door 5 minutes later with a second list reel, this time of every shipment that had vanished between Sandusky and Erie the year the mines paid out the largest dividends. S.D. read both lists twice and realized one could burn the other. The counterfeit marked petty graft. The real list spoke to grand larceny and murder dressed in accountancy. Ward added an arithmetic lesson, the exact margin by which the Blackstone's lake ventures had outperformed Storm's. "That's not God," Ward said softly. "That's someone nailing shut a hatch." SD did not confess. Men like him do not confess to the first door they open. But he folded both lists into his coat and asked a question that tasted like surrender. If a man were tired of walking in circles, where would he walk instead into daylight? Clara said. "We don't need you on a witness stand. We need you to miss trains at the right hour." He nodded. In that nod lived a dozen late arrivals, 2 messages delayed and 1 crate misrouted toward a prosecutor instead of a counting house. When SD stepped back into the alley, he wore the same face he had walked in with. But his shadow had changed sides, misrouting the machine. Altoona's rail yard was a cathedral of steel where sermons were preached in whistles. The third captain, MB, kept his desk in a glass booth above the switching ladder, a little throne with levers for scepters. He believed in 2 things, schedules and fear. Men who believed in fear could be made to hear other voices. Ward and Henley spent the day mapping hand signals used by yard crews, the chop the circle, the flat palm that could stop a freight dead. By dusk they knew how to move a train 1 car at a time without a single spoken word. Clara, meanwhile, paid a visit to the roundhouse with a tin of plum preserves for the foreman's wife. "I sew," she said, and left with a spool of red thread in the foreman's grudging goodwill. They worked from midnight to 2 and the yard ran on habit. Red thread tied to lever bases. A chalk mark at a frog that just happened to look like any other chalk mark. A switchman whose sore ankle kept him on the platform 10 minutes longer than usual. Nothing dramatic, just the smallest edits to a mechanical sentence. At 2:15, the Pittsburgh Express rolled through. At 2:16, a sealed mailbag labeled for a Blackstone attorney's office slid into a sack destined for the U.S. attorney instead. At 2:17, MB cursed a bottleneck he couldn't locate, while the yard's lanterns told obedient lies. Henley watched the express vanish into the mountain cut and felt a primitive satisfaction he did not share aloud. Clara tucked her red thread back into her pocket hands, steady. Ward checked his watch and murmured, "A dozen such minutes and we write a year." By dawn, the Blackstones had lost a bag they didn't yet know they were missing, and the U.S. attorney had gained a packet he had not dared hope existed, orders, payments, notations in a clerk's tidy hand, remarking which disasters had served our larger purpose. Machines rarely scream when you carve out a gear. They grind louder, then fail, breaking the circle. The roster gave them cadence. The next move required a chorus. Henley took the stand he had long avoided, the moral one. He wrote to the miners' lodges and the switchmen's union under a name no one could ignore, Emmeline Avery, as if the parish had risen to right the living. It was a trick and a sin in the usual sense, but not in the deeper one. The parish had been broken open by truth. He simply borrowed its bell. Clara organized 2 meetings, one in a church basement in Wheeling, another in a temperance hall in Meadville, where the floor sloped and every speech sounded like it was trying to climb. They didn't bring the ledger. They brought the arithmetic and the photographs, men with soot in the lines of their faces, a collapsed trestle, a widow standing in a doorway made smaller by grief. Ward had names for the numbers and the numbers for the names. "Disaster is not a weather pattern," Henley told the room in Meadville. "It is a business model, and you are the product." The line was Clara's, but he carried the weight of it like it had always lived under his tongue. They asked for nothing that sounded like revolution and everything that sounded like stubbornness. Delay that order by an hour. Ask for a written signature instead of a spoken one. If a supervisor says don't log that, log it twice. If a mailbag looks too heavy, weigh it. If a train looks too light, count it. By the end of the week, dozens of small refusals were alive across 3 states. Schedules frayed, warehouses miscounted, telegraph keys hesitated as if struck by conscience. The Blackstones could buy newspapers and judges and private detectives, but they could not buy that glittering thing that had slipped back into the air, the pleasure of disobedience in the service of a clean ledger. The house splinters. When a machine stutters, the men who own it argue. The Blackstone counting house on 5th Street was a temple to restraint, polished floors, locked drawers, the smell of lemon oil, warring with tobacco. But restraint cracked when the Pittsburgh attorney wired to say a sealed bag had arrived on a desk that was not his. In the first meeting after the wire, the patriarch's nephews spoke in turns that became overlaps. One blamed an overzealous captain, meaning MB. Another blamed a spoiled fishwife in Sandusky, meaning SD. The eldest nephew favored a solution spelled in gunmetal. The youngest favored a charitable donation to a cathedral in exchange for public absolution. None favored quiet. Behind the polished paneling, clerks copied out what should never have been written twice. In the alley, a boy stubbed out a cigarette and ran the long way to the telegraph office with what he'd heard family dispute mention of testimony money allocated to rectify the prosecutorial climate. Ward read the wire on a hotel bed with springs that muttered old ghost complaints. "They're bleedin' in daylight," he said. "They'll cauterize with fire if we let them." Clara proposed the wound stay open. "We don't need all of them to panic," she said. "Just one with a conscience soft as bread." Which nephew would crack, not the eldest, made of iron filings and rage? The youngest, perhaps, who still believed in paper as something other than a gun. Henley drafted a letter that was both confession and escape hatch, addressed to that youngest nephew, referencing a mother's maiden name no newspaper would know. "We have copies in safer hands than ours," the letter read. "Testimony ends this cleanly. Blood ends it for a season and stains a decade." He included a time and a church and a pew number. If the nephew came, a door might open. If he sent men with clubs, another kind of door would close and the street would hear it. Either way, the house had splintered. Splinters have edges and edges cut. The bell and the trap. They chose St. Hildegard's because its bell was cracked and anyone sensible avoided its services. Because the sacristy had 2 exits. Because Father Avery's name lingered there in the dust like a watermark. Henley knelt in the 3rd pew and let the cold travel up his knees. Clara waited in the choir loft with a derringer she hated but would not surrender. Ward stood outside with an umbrella and the look of a man minding his own reign. At 5 past the hour, the youngest nephew entered, hat in hands, eyes flicking like a trapped bird's. He smelled of expensive soap and sleeplessness. He sat where the letter had told him. He did not pray. "I want this over," he said without preface. "I want to stop waking to ash." Henley did not lie. "Then you will speak on record. Names, dates, payments. We will give you a copy and keep 2 more. You will lose your name to your kin and keep it with the public. There is no neatness from here." The nephew's hands shook. "Do you promise to keep my mother out of print?" "Yes," Henley said, and meant it as far as the world would let him. Footsteps in the narthex. Ward's umbrella tilted a small agreed-upon signal through the stained glass. The nephew flinched. 3 men entered too, with the walk of hired muscle one with the hat of a lawyer who hadn't slept since the 19th century. The lawyer cleared his throat as if to address a jury. Clara from the loft settled the derringer's muzzle to the rail. "You are making a spectacle," the lawyer began. "A family matter is not a public crime until it buys a newspaper." Clara said, her voice falling from the rafters like dust. "You're a week late to that revelation." Ward stepped into the aisle unarmed and offered the lawyer a folded paper, a copy of the intercepted mailbag index. "You can read, or you can try to outrun type. One is faster." The hired men hesitated. Paid courage counts coins in real time. The nephew stood without being told, walked past them, and sat beside Henley in the open. It was a small act, and it was the whole thing. The lawyer saw the balance tip and tried to fix it with threats shaped like concern. "You'll bring ruin," he said. "It's already here," the nephew answered. "I'm just giving it a baptismal name." The cracked bell tolled once on a wind that wasn't there. Henley did not take it for an omen, only a timer. Outside, a pressman they'd wired 2 days earlier waited with a horse, like a newsroom, lean, impatient, hungry for copy. Inside, the lawyer retreated 2 steps, then 3, doing the arithmetic of defeat. The trap had not been to catch them in a crime. The crime was already caught. The trap was to make a choice occur in a public place where choices echo. When the men left, the church smelled of damp wool and the faint metal scent of a beginning. The nephew exhaled. "Tell me what I must say," he whispered. "Exactly what's true," Henley said, "and all of it." Mapping the hunt. The roster lay open on the hay between them, each name a thread leading back to the black stones. Ward had already begun marking patterns, agents assigned to specific regions, others who moved with the speed of telegraph lines carrying orders before ink could dry. Clara leaned in her gloved finger, tapping the ones she knew from Pinkerton files. "This one's greedy. He'll talk if we make it worth his while. This one won't break unless we put him in a corner. That one just plain stupid." Henley saw the shape of it. Now they didn't need to fight every man. They just needed to pull the right ones out of place. Cut a few key lines, and the rest of the machine would stall. First strike in Quincy. They started with a man named Hollis, an enforcer who'd been leaning on small-town editors to kill stories. Ward forged a telegram from Philadelphia headquarters, summoning Hollis to a meeting at a warehouse in Quincy. When he arrived expecting to collect payment, Clara and Henley were waiting in the shadows. A quiet threat, a rope dangling from a ceiling beam swaying gently, and Hollis's tongue loosened. He gave up 2 names, men responsible for moving bribes along the Ohio River. By the time Hollis stumbled out into the cold, the information was already on its way to a friendly reporter in St. Louis. Cutting the river line. The Ohio was the Blackstone's artery, moving goods and cash between inland operations and coastal fronts. With the names Hollis had given Ward, intercepted a shipment manifest, and Clara arranged for the riverboat's cargo to be misplaced at a dock in Cairo. When the crates were opened by customs, they revealed not grain or coal, but stacks of falsified death certificates, each one tied to an insurance payout. The discovery made the front page in 3 states. The Blackstones responded by tightening security, but in doing so, they slowed their own operations, a ripple Henley intended to turn into a wave. Smoke in Pittsburgh. They planted their next disruption in the Blackstone's own backyard. A mill in Pittsburgh, one the family used as a quiet meeting spot, went up in flames after an accidental furnace malfunction. No one was hurt, but the fire destroyed Ledger's correspondence and, most importantly, the safe that had housed their regional payroll. Henley knew the cost wasn't just in coin, it was in trust. Men who didn't get paid on time asked questions, and questions were dangerous for a family built on shadows. The turncoat from the roster. Clara picked out a mid-level fixer named Elias Crow, who'd been passed over for promotion twice. Ward sent him a note, plain and direct. "You're next on their list to vanish. Want to avoid it? Meet us." Crow showed up at the agreed spot, a shuttered brewery with sweat on his collar despite the cold. Within an hour, they had details on a planned meeting between 3 senior Blackstone operatives in Indianapolis. When Henley asked him why, Crow shrugged. "They don't look after their own anymore. Figure it's time I did the same. Ambush at the crossing." The Indianapolis meeting never happened. Clara and Henley intercepted the operative's carriage at a rural rail crossing, forcing it off the road. No shots were fired, but when the men walked away, it was without their briefcases or their dignity. Inside the cases were payment schedules, travel itineraries, and a stack of letters linking the Blackstones to a senator in Harrisburg. That last piece would be worth gold when the time came to go public, shifting the balance. For weeks they kept the pressure on, sometimes striking directly, other times just letting the Blackstones trip over the holes they'd punched in the network. The family was bleeding resources, sending twice as many men to do half the work. Henley, watching from the window of a safe house in Cleveland, could feel the tide turning. "They're not chasing us anymore," he said to Clara. "They're trying to plug leaks." Ward looked up from the roster, now covered in slashes and crossed out names. "Good. That means the next hit won't just hurt them, it'll knock them off their feet." The Harrisburg connection. The letters were gold. Ward spread them across the table, the candlelight picking out the senator's signature, the careful phrasing that danced around direct admission, yet dripped with complicity. Dates matched with disaster payouts. Charitable contributions were just bribes in tidy ink. Clara tapped one letter. "If these go to the right editor, it'll bury him before the next election." Henley didn't smile. "And the Blackstones will know exactly who put the shovel in their hands." Still, they agreed the timing was perfect. One more push, and the family's political shield would crack, exposing them to legal fire they couldn't bribe their way out of. Seeding the fuse. They didn't drop all the letters at once. Ward leaked the first 2 to a small reformist paper in Scranton, knowing the big city outlets would pick them up within days. Clara made sure the trail back to them was invisible, handing them off to a school teacher who passed them to a printer who swore by civic duty. By week's end, Harrisburg was humming with rumor. The senator denied everything, but denials have a way of drawing more eyes. Henley watched from afar, knowing the Blackstones would be feeling the walls close in. The family's response. The answer came in the form of a name Henley hadn't heard in years, Silas Kane. In the old days, Kane had been a Pinkerton agent, the kind who took cases, others refused. Rumor was he'd been bought by the Blackstones after a particularly bloody job in Baltimore. Kane's specialty wasn't investigation, it was elimination. He had a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found and making sure they never troubled his employers again. When Ward saw the telegram from a contact in Philadelphia, Kane on the move, his jaw tightened. If he's in play, we've got days, maybe less. Smoke on the tracks. The first sign was a burned telegraph office outside Lancaster, one they'd used for relays. Then a contact in Wheeling turned up beaten so badly he couldn't speak. Kane was cutting away their lifelines, forcing them into the open. Henley insisted they keep moving, but Clara could feel the circle tightening. "He's not chasing us," she said one night in a drafty boarding house. "He's steering us, herding us where he wants us." The narrow street in Toledo. It nearly ended there. They were moving between safe houses when Henley caught a shadow, where no man should have been leaning in an alley, mouth hat brim low. The street was narrow, the lamps dim, and the sound of footsteps followed them too evenly to be chance. Kane stepped into view like he'd been waiting his whole life for the moment. "Mr. Henley." He drawled voice like gravel. "We've got business." What happened next was chaos. Ward firing first Kane, vanishing into the dark, the echo of boots fading. They escaped, but only just the memory of that smile burning into Henley's mind, setting a trap. They couldn't outrun him forever. Henley proposed something Clara thought was madness, turned the hunt back on Kane. Using the senator's scandal as bait, they'd leak word of a final meeting with a key witness in a place and time of their choosing. Ward secured the location, a derelict station outside Pittsburgh. Clara took care of the rest, making sure the rumor reached exactly the ears it needed to. Collision at dusk. The station smelled of rust and old coal. They waited in the shadows, the last light bleeding from the sky. Kane arrived as predicted, moving with that unhurried confidence of a man who'd never been cornered. Only this time, he was. The fight was brutal. Close fast, every movement about survival. Kane was skilled, but 3 against 1 in his chosen killing ground turned the tide. When it was done, he was breathing but broken, left with the message Henley wanted delivered. "Tell them we're not running anymore." Turning the spotlight with Kane, neutralized, Henley's group could finally move without the shadow of immediate pursuit. Ward gathered every scrap of evidence they'd collected, ledgers, letters, bribe lists, forged death records, and began assembling them into a single airtight dossier. Clara worked the human side quietly, persuading survivors and witnesses to speak. Many were terrified, convinced the Blackstone's reach could still strangle them. But the scandal in Harrisburg had shifted public mood. People were starting to believe the family could be hurt. Henley knew they needed one decisive push, a way to force the nation's attention where it couldn't be turned away. The Philadelphia Gambit. The plan was simple in its outline, dangerous in its execution. Present their evidence to the Philadelphia Daily Ledger, the most widely read paper east of the Mississippi, and do it in such a way that the Blackstones couldn't stop the presses without outing themselves. Ward met with the editor, a bulldog named Everett Shaw, in a back room of the paper's print hall. Shaw flipped through the documents, his eyebrows climbing with each page. "If even half of this is true," Shaw said, "I'll have every press in the city running it by dawn." Henley only replied, "It's all true. Retaliation in the streets." The Blackstones didn't take the move quietly. That night, 2 men in long coats tried to corner Clara outside the Ledger offices. She fought them off with a pistol Ward had insisted she carry, leaving one with a shattered arm and the other limping. By morning, the paper's front page screamed headlines that made even Washington take notice: "Insurance Empire tied to mass. Death conspiracy." The black stones had been dragged into the open. The public outcry was immediate. The hearings begin. Congressional hearings were called within weeks, spurred by a wave of political pressure and the ruin of the Harrisburg senator. Henley and Clara were summoned to testify, their statements read into the record alongside mountains of documentary evidence. Ward handled the logistics, ensuring copies of the files were stored in multiple secure locations. "If anything happens to us," he told Henley, "this still sees daylight." The hearings were explosive, witnesses describing systematic killings, insurance fraud, on an industrial scale, and the chilling efficiency with which the Blackstones had turned life and death into ledger entries. The cracks widen. Not everyone in the Blackstone network was willing to go down with the ship. Several mid-level operatives came forward, trading testimony for leniency. Each new voice confirmed the same patterns, each confession adding weight to the prosecution's case. The family's legal team tried to stall to question the credibility of witnesses, but the sheer volume of evidence overwhelmed them. Henley, watching from the gallery, felt the strange satisfaction of seeing something monstrous begin to crumble. The courtroom war. The trials that followed were long, bitter, and dangerous. Jurors were bribed, threatened, and in one case disappeared. But each attempt only made headlines, reinforcing the image of the Blackstones as a family desperate to escape justice. Clara took the stand with unflinching poise, detailing names, dates, and crimes she'd seen firsthand. Henley testified for 3 full days, never once looking at the defendants. When the verdicts finally came guilty on counts that would see the principal members imprisoned for life, the courtroom erupted in a way Henley would remember for the rest of his days. Aftermath. The Blackstone Empire didn't vanish overnight, but its spine was broken. Assets were seized. Subsidiaries collapsed, and the family's name became a byword for greed and cruelty. Henley, Clara, and Ward slipped quietly out of public life. For them, victory wasn't a parade, it was the quiet knowledge that the machine had stopped turning, that the ledger of death was finally closed. One winter morning, months later, Henley stood in the Pennsylvania hills where the whole thing had begun. Snow covered the ground, muffling the world. For the first time in years, there were no footsteps behind him.